Forget the wild online rumors and look directly at the actual investigative records. On February 8th, the FBI brought digital data extraction devices right into Annie Guthrie's home. At the exact same time, investigators towed Tommaso Sione's Range Rover away and securely sealed it inside an evidence impound lot for 32 consecutive days. So, let me ask this. Why does the FBI seize a grieving family's car and systematically download their entire digital footprint when they already have a clear video of a masked intruder? What I found was that this wasn't just some random search. I spent days deeply analyzing the forensic timeline, the digital extraction logs, and the official police statements to uncover the truth behind the investigation. And let me tell you, the hard evidence shows exactly why the FBI really had to look closely at the daughter and son-in-law first, before pursuing anyone else out there. Imagine a pool of blood drying on a quiet Arizona porch, and right next to it, a discarded bottle of heart medication. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old, and these pills are her lifeline. Think about it. Any kidnapper smart enough to disable a security system knows a dead hostage pays $0. Leaving that medicine behind is a death sentence. This glaring contradiction forced me to ask one haunting question: was this ever a real abduction, or just a clumsy stage play meant to hide a crime that ended right at her doorstep? To find the truth, I have spent countless hours digging through every single page of the Pima County search warrants. I cross-referenced raw surveillance video with digital location history to map out the real timeline. What I discovered buried in those files is a dark reality that looks nothing like the sanitized story officials are telling. So, before we even start analyzing the forensic evidence or squinting at that grainy surveillance footage, we have to take a step back and look at the motive. Most people want to jump straight to the horror, but the why is always found in the foundation of the home. Nancy Guthrie did not just end up in Tucson by mistake. She moved to the desert specifically to be closer to her daughter Annie and her son-in-law Tommaso Sione. On the surface, this was a story about family values. We are looking at a group of people with absolutely no history of violence. Not a single emergency 911 call was ever logged at that address. There were no messy court battles, no public feuds, and no neighbors reporting strange noises in the middle of the night. It looked like the perfect retirement for an 84-year-old woman. But, as anyone who has ever lived in a small town knows, silence does not always mean everything is fine. Sometimes, silence is just a very expensive veil. We need to talk about the money, because in cases like this, the money usually tells the truth when people will not. Nancy lived in a gorgeous adobe-style home tucked away in the Catalina foothills. If you know anything about Tucson real estate, you know that this area is where the elite live. We are talking about houses with panoramic mountain views and infinity pools. Experts in the local market estimate that Nancy's property is worth at least $2 million. Now, let us pause for a second and do the math. If you divide that $2 million asset among her 3 children, each branch of the family stands to inherit nearly $700,000. The thing is, $700,000 is a lot of money to almost anyone, but it is a fortune to someone living on an educator's salary. Tommaso Sione spent years working in academia and teaching. It is a respected life, but it is rarely a wealthy one. At the same time, we have to look at the reality of Nancy's health. She was 84 years old. She had a pacemaker and a list of prescriptions as long as your arm, which means that while the love might have been there, the burden was also there. Constant medical checkups, the looming threat of expensive nursing home care, and the daily grind of monitoring an elderly parent can create a very specific kind of resentment. It is a slow-burning fire that most families never talk about. What I found was that while the world saw a grandmother enjoying her golden years, there might have been a very different conversation happening behind closed doors. Maybe someone was looking at the rising cost of healthcare and the stagnating value of their own bank account. In other words, the house in the hills was not just a home anymore. It was a massive, untapped life insurance policy waiting for a signature. Which tells us that the opportunity was there. And the motive was definitely there. You see, the problem with a $2 million inheritance is that it only becomes real when the owner is gone. And for someone struggling to make ends meet, that wait can start to feel like an eternity. And this is important because we have to ask ourselves if we are looking at a tragic disappearance or a calculated financial move. At this point, the lack of conflict in the official records actually starts to look suspicious. How can a family be that perfect? From there, I started thinking about the psychological toll of caregiving. It is a heavy weight to carry. And sometimes, people just want to be free of it, especially if there is a massive payday waiting on the other side. The reason this matters is that it changes the way we see every single interaction that happened on that final night. Was it a loving dinner, or was it a final inspection? This leads me to a detail that really disturbed me. While Savannah was off building her own wealth, the local family in Tucson was the one doing the heavy lifting. They were the ones dealing with the doctors and the daily needs. That kind of inequality can breed a very bitter type of jealousy. Which brings me to this shock. Could financial pressure and $2 million create a killer? Tell your thoughts below. What happened next is the part that truly turns this investigation from a tragedy into something much more chilling. We need to walk through the final hours of January 31st carefully. Everything seemed normal. Tommaso drove Nancy home after they had finished their dinner together. At 9:48 in the evening, his car pulled into a quiet driveway in the Catalina foothills. The car went inside, and for a moment, the house was a sanctuary. Just 2 minutes later, at 9:50 in the evening, the garage door closed and Tommaso drove away. According to official records, Nancy Guthrie was safely inside her home, locked away from the world. But this is where the story starts to fracture. If this was a random predator or a professional kidnapper who had followed them from the restaurant, you would expect them to strike immediately. Usually things go this way. They take advantage of the transition the moment the door is unlocked or the minute the lights go out. Digital evidence shows otherwise. The house sat in undisturbed silence for nearly 4 hours. The Ring doorbell camera was active, the sensors were on, and nothing moved. At the same time, the desert night was getting colder, dropping down toward freezing. The problem is, the security system was not disabled until 1:47 in the morning on February 1st. Think about that for a second. That is a massive gap of 3 hours and 57 minutes. It was not until nearly 2 in the morning that a masked figure finally appeared on the porch and cut the connection to the camera. What struck me here was the sheer absurdity of that level of patience. If this was a stranger, why crouch in freezing shadows for 4 hours after the only other person left the house? It does not make any logical sense for a stalker to wait that long when the house was at its most vulnerable, the moment Tommaso drove away. Why wait until the dead of night to step onto that porch? The reason this matters is because that 4-hour window changes everything about the suspect list. In other words, this was not a crime of opportunity, it was a crime of timing. Looking at the map, 4 hours is more than enough time for someone to drive across town, go into their own home, change into dark clothing, grab a hiking backpack, and return without raising a single red flag. Which means, the person who disabled that camera at 1:47 in the morning did not have to be someone who was hiding in the bushes. They could have been someone who had been there earlier, someone who knew exactly when the house would be quiet, and someone who had a perfect excuse to be on the road that night. And this is important because it points toward a level of premeditation that is terrifying. If you are a stranger, you are taking a huge risk by lingering. Every minute you wait is a minute someone might look out a window or a police cruiser might roll by. But if you are someone who knows the schedule of the house, that 4-hour gap is not a wait. It is a tactical window. You go home, you establish an alibi, you wait for the neighborhood to fall into its deepest sleep, and then you come back to finish the job. Which tells us that whoever did this was not just lucky. They were calculated. They knew the layout. They knew the cameras. From there, we have to ask about the digital footprint. Was there any movement detected by internal sensors during those 4 hours? So far, the authorities have been very quiet about that. But what we do know is that the silence ended at 1:47. That is the moment the mask went on and the lights went out for Nancy. At this point, the question is not just who did it, but where were they during that long, dark interval between 9:50 and 1:47? The answer is the key to the mystery. We must find the truth. At this point, we have to look closely at how the attacker actually operated that night. When investigators arrived at the property in the Catalina foothills, they immediately noticed something very strange about the perimeter of the house. There was absolutely no sign of forced entry. The windows were perfectly intact, the door frames were not splintered, and the locks were completely undamaged. This means the person who took Nancy Guthrie either had a key, knew the security codes, or was someone she trusted enough to open the door for in the middle of the night. It tells us that things went wrong before the victim even left her property. The supposed master plan fell apart immediately. Someone truly lost control right outside the front wooden door. But the illusion of a peaceful interaction shatters the moment you look down at the ground. Investigators found a pool of blood right there on the front porch. A struggle happened at the very threshold of her safe haven. Blood means violence, and violence means panic. The thing is, the forensic timeline gives us an even more chilling detail. Nancy had a pacemaker installed to keep her heart beating steadily. Modern pacemakers are incredible pieces of technology. They constantly transmit data via a wireless connection to a smartphone application. The authorities pulled the digital logs, and those logs tell a terrifying story. At exactly 2:28 in the morning, the application on her phone lost its connection to the pacemaker in her chest. This signal only has a short range. This exact minute marks the exact moment her body was carried away from her phone. He took her out into the cold desert darkness, but he left her smartphone sitting right there inside the house. And he did not just leave the phone behind, he left something much more important. He left all of her daily medication. Nancy was an 84-year-old woman with a serious cardiac condition. Her life literally depended on those prescription bottles sitting on her counter. Now, let us think about the psychology of a traditional ransom situation. If you are a criminal who wants to extort $2 million from a wealthy family, your hostage is your only leverage. Your hostage is your paycheck. Any kidnapper with half a brain knows that if they do not bring the heart medication, the hostage will die. If the hostage dies, there is no proof of life, and if there is no proof of life, nobody is going to pay you a single dime. Leaving that medication behind is the biggest mistake a professional could make, which leads me to believe this was never a professional operation at all. The fact that the medication was abandoned proves that whoever took her simply did not care if she lived or died. In fact, they probably already knew she was beyond saving. When you combine the discarded life-saving pills with the fresh blood found out on the porch, a very dark picture begins to form. We are likely looking at a botched fake kidnapping. Someone came to that house, and an altercation occurred right at the doorway. Maybe it was an argument that escalated, or maybe it was a deliberate physical assault. When an 84-year-old woman is pushed or shoved, the results are catastrophic. She likely hit the ground hard, causing the bleeding. Her fragile heart might have given out right then and there. Once she was dead on the porch, the perpetrator panicked. You cannot leave a body on the porch if you want to get away with it. So, the plan had to change instantly. The kidnapping was just a theatrical cover story, a desperate improvisation designed to get the corpse away from the property and explain why she was missing. They threw a mask on, disabled the cameras late, and dragged her away. They created a ghost story about a masked intruder to distract the police from the reality of a domestic homicide. It was all smoke and mirrors, meant to confuse the entire investigation. The evidence paints a picture of a tragic accident or a sudden burst of rage that ended terribly. A real kidnapper would never leave behind the one thing keeping their payday alive. Looking at the abandoned medication and the blood at the door, if you put yourself in the shoes of an investigator, do you believe this is a ransom kidnapping? Or is it a murder and body disposal? And then, after days of agonizing silence and wild speculation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation finally released a detailed physical description of the mysterious, masked figure caught on the security system. The man who walked up to the porch and severed the camera connection at exactly 1:47 in the morning was no longer just a blurry shadow in the darkness. The authorities had used digital forensics to measure his exact proportions against the doorframe of the house. They announced that the unknown suspect was a male, standing somewhere between 5 feet 9 inches and 5 feet 10 inches tall. He was further described as having a very average build, not overly muscular, but clearly capable of significant physical exertion. For a brief moment, this description felt almost too generic to be helpful. There are thousands of men residing in the state of Arizona who fit that exact height and weight profile. It initially seemed like a dead end for the detectives working to solve this baffling mystery. But then, the investigators dropped a crucial piece of information that changed the entire complexion of the case. They released a clear, enhanced image of the bag strapped to the suspect's shoulders. He was wearing a black 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack. This is not a typical school bag or a standard briefcase used for commuting to an office. This is a highly specific piece of outdoor gear designed for navigating rough terrain and carrying heavy loads over long distances. It is the exact kind of backpack favored by people who spend their weekends trekking through the wilderness or climbing steep, rocky trails. Why would a random kidnapper choose a wilderness survival backpack to commit a crime in a wealthy residential neighborhood? That single piece of nylon canvas suddenly narrowed the suspect pool from any average man on the street to someone who was intimately familiar with the unforgiving outdoors. This is the part I could not get past. When you take that Federal Bureau of Investigation profile and hold it up next to Tommaso Cioni, the similarities become terrifying. Tommaso is an adult male who stands exactly within that 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches height range, possessing the exact same shoulder width and posture. His physical build matches the masked man in the surveillance video perfectly. Furthermore, Tommaso is a man who lives in the mountainous regions of Tucson. He is widely known to be an active individual who thoroughly understands the desert terrain surrounding the city. If someone desperately needed to make a body disappear in the vast, rocky expanse of the Arizona wilderness, a local hiker would know exactly where to go. They would know the hidden trails, the deep ravines, and the isolated places where law enforcement would never even think to look. And if the height, the average build, and the hiking backpack were not enough to make you pause, there is one more critical detail hidden within that footage. If you take the high-resolution still image provided by the authorities and zoom in closely on the suspect's face, you can see something underneath the dark ski mask. The fabric of the mask is stretched very tight across his facial features, and right above his upper lip, there is a distinct, dark shadow. It is the unmistakable outline of a thick mustache protruding just slightly against the material. Now, go look at any public photograph of Tommaso Cioni. He proudly wears a prominent, dark mustache on his face. The physical alignment is no longer just a passing resemblance. It is a mirror image captured in the dead of night. When you stack all of these puzzle pieces together, the resulting picture becomes incredibly difficult to ignore. We have a suspect who matches the exact height and average build of the son-in-law. We have a suspect carrying a specialized 25-liter hiking backpack, a perfect accessory for an outdoorsman living in the Tucson mountains. And we have the faint but undeniable outline of a mustache hidden beneath a winter ski mask. You have to ask yourself about the mathematics of chance. What are the odds that a random, violent stranger possessing all of these exact same physical traits just happened to target this specific house on this specific night? The height matches, the hiking backpack matches, the mustache matches. Do you think this is the unluckiest coincidence in the world? Or has the killer actually revealed himself? Meanwhile, if you turn on the television news during the first 2 weeks of this investigation, you will see a very specific narrative being pushed by the authorities. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos has been standing up at podiums, looking directly into the camera, and aggressively defending the family. He has publicly scolded independent journalists and news networks, calling their reporting reckless and demanding that they stop throwing baseless accusations at the daughter and son-in-law. To the average viewer watching at home, the message from law enforcement is crystal clear. Tommaso and his wife are grieving victims. They are completely cooperating with the investigation, and they are absolutely not considered suspects in this terrifying abduction. The sheriff is essentially acting as a human shield for the family, trying to control the public outrage and redirect attention back to the mysterious masked man with the hiking backpack. This public relations strategy is designed to project absolute unity between the detectives and the grieving relatives. It creates a powerful illusion that everyone is working together seamlessly to bring a missing grandmother home safely. But in the world of true crime, you must never listen to what the police say at a press conference. You must only look at what they actually do when the cameras are turned off. Let us look at the official search warrants filed in the local court. While the sheriff was busy protecting the reputation of Tommaso on national television, his own detectives were quietly standing in front of a judge, swearing under oath that they had probable cause to search that exact same family home. You do not get a judge to sign a search warrant just to ask a few routine questions. The detectives went into the residence and systematically confiscated their personal electronic devices. They took the cellular telephones, they took the computers, and they took the digital storage drives. They are looking for deleted text messages, hidden financial records, and hidden location data. They want to know exactly who Tommaso was talking to during those 4 missing hours. They want to trace every single digital step he took that night. And then came the most horrifying detail of the entire investigation so far. As the detectives were tearing through the house, they ordered a massive industrial pump truck to pull up right into the yard. They opened up the underground septic tank attached to the property and proceeded to completely drain and suck out every single drop of waste inside it. In other words, you do not pump a septic tank to find a living, breathing 84-year-old hostage. You do not look in a sewer for a kidnapping victim who is waiting to be rescued. You only do something that extreme and that disgusting because you are looking for things that someone desperately tried to flush away and destroy forever. You do that to find a murder weapon. You do that to find a shattered cellular telephone. You do that to find shredded clothing soaked in human blood. Or, most terrifyingly of all, you do that because you are looking for dismembered pieces of a human body hidden deep beneath the ground. This specific action crosses a massive line in any standard missing persons investigation. It shifts the entire focus from a frantic rescue mission into a grim recovery operation. This aggressive, Invasive search completely betrays the comforting words the sheriff has been feeding to the public. You simply do not rip apart the plumbing infrastructure of a grieving family unless you secretly consider them your number one suspect. The authorities are playing a brilliant, high-stakes game of psychological warfare. They are smiling at the family through the television screen, lulling them into a false sense of security, while simultaneously tearing up their backyard looking for a corpse. It is a textbook investigative strategy designed to keep the prime suspects calm so they do not hire expensive defense attorneys and stop talking. The police know exactly who they are dealing with, and the empty septic tank proves it. They are letting the suspect believe he has outsmarted them, while they quietly gather the forensic evidence needed to lock him away forever. What do you think about this strategy? If you were watching the police pump your own septic tank while telling the world you are innocent, would you realize they are silently building a murder case against you? Let me know your thoughts down below now. The reason this matters is that every single person watching this case unfold is asking the exact same question. If the physical profile matches so perfectly, and if the timeline points so directly at the son-in-law, why is Tommaso not currently sitting in a jail cell wearing a pair of cold steel handcuffs? It is the most frustrating part of following a true crime investigation in real time. We see the puzzle pieces fitting together perfectly on our screens, and we expect the authorities to kick down a door immediately. But the reality of the justice system is much more complicated than our armchair detective work. Logical deduction, no matter how brilliant or convincing it might seem to the public, is absolutely not the same thing as undeniable physical evidence in a court of law. A prosecutor cannot walk into a courtroom and simply tell a jury that the suspect looks like the guy in the surveillance video. They need hard, irrefutable facts and proof. If the police arrest him too early based purely on suspicion and a matching backpack, a clever lawyer will create reasonable doubt, and a guilty man might walk free forever. They only get one shot at a murder trial, and they cannot afford to miss. And that is exactly why the police are maintaining this agonizing silence. They are not ignoring Tommaso. They are actively building a massive digital profile behind the scenes. We are currently living in an era where it is virtually impossible to commit a crime without leaving a trail of invisible electronic breadcrumbs. The detectives are fighting a digital war right now. They need to forensically examine the global positioning system history embedded deep inside the computer of Tommaso's vehicle. They need to know exactly where that car was located during that terrifying 4-hour gap between 9:50 in the evening and 1:47 in the morning. Did the engine turn on? Furthermore, they are ripping apart his cellular network data. They need to extract the cell tower triangulation logs to verify his alibi. If he claims he was sound asleep in his own bed at 1:47 in the morning, his telephone needs to confirm that it was stationary and connected to his home internet router, not bouncing off a tower located 3 miles away near Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood. Every single modern vehicle is essentially a computer on wheels, constantly recording speed, braking patterns, and exact coordinates. Did he connect his phone to the car Bluetooth interface during those missing hours? These invisible records do not lie, and they cannot be intimidated on the witness stand. At this point, I started questioning the entire pacing of the investigation, and then I remembered another major event in this case. Think about the arrest of Derek Colella, the scammer from California who tried to extort the family by pretending to be the kidnapper. The Federal Bureau of Investigation tracked him down and had him in federal custody almost instantly. That arrest happened so incredibly fast. What does that tell us? It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the federal agents have an absolute stranglehold on the digital bandwidth surrounding this case. They possess the technology and the authority to trace cellular data across state lines in a matter of hours. So, if they have that kind of lightning-fast capability, why are they being so painfully slow and silent when it comes to the local family members? The answer is both brilliant and terrifying. If they are staying silent about Tommaso, it means they are not just looking for a single text message. They are waiting for the forensic analysis of a colossal mountain of data. We are talking about terabytes of information pulled from internet service providers, vehicle telematics, and encrypted applications. Processing that level of digital evidence properly so that it holds up against a defense attorney can take months, or sometimes even a full year. They are casting a massive net, looking for the smallest anomaly. A deleted internet search about how to dispose of a body, a burner phone purchased weeks in advance, or a sudden, unexplained financial transaction. They are patiently building a digital cage so tight that when they finally spring the trap, neither he nor any potential accomplice will have any room left to lie. They want the suspect to feel that invisible net tightening around them every single day until the digital footprint forces a confession. Which tells us we are standing right on the edge of the absolute worst-case scenario imaginable. We have a very clear financial motive tied directly to a massive $2 million estate. We have a terrifying and completely unexplained 4-hour time gap where the house sat completely silent in the freezing cold. We have a physical crime scene that looks exactly like a clumsy, horribly botched stage play deliberately designed to distract the professional investigators from the real, hidden truth. And above all else, we have a prime suspect caught on camera wearing a specialized hiker backpack, possessing facial and physical features that perfectly match the son-in-law. Everything points inward, not outward. When I piece this entire sequence of events together, I realize the police are not actually stuck at a dead end at all. They are simply, meticulously setting elaborate legal traps all around the suspect. They know that time is the ultimate enemy of a guilty conscience. Every single day that passes without an official arrest is a long, agonizing day the perpetrator wakes up terrified, wondering if today is the exact day the federal agents finally knock on the front door. The authorities are strategically letting the intense pressure build, allowing the paranoid suspect to make careless mistakes, to whisper to an accomplice in secret, or to nervously check a digital device one too many times. The total silence from the local sheriff is a brilliantly calculated psychological weapon. It intentionally lulls the guilty party into a false sense of absolute security while the invisible digital net tightens around them. The detectives do not need a rushed confession right now. They patiently need a mountain of undeniable data. They need the cellular tower pings, the global positioning system coordinates extracted from the car, and the hidden internet search history. They are quietly building an impenetrable fortress of electronic evidence that no expensive defense attorney could ever tear down. When you look at the entire investigative board, from the fresh blood on the porch to the completely drained septic tank, you can clearly see the invisible walls slowly closing in on the person who committed this terrible act. This case leaves us with a truly chilling lesson about blind trust, domestic deception, and personal safety. We spend our entire lives diligently locking our doors and religiously checking our security alarms to protect ourselves from the unknown boogeymen outside. We are taught from childhood to deeply fear the violent stranger lurking in the dark alleyway or the random, opportunistic predator stalking the quiet neighborhood. But sometimes, the most profound and deadly threat does not come from a faceless stranger roaming the streets at midnight. Sometimes, the ultimate, inescapable danger is already sitting right there inside your own house. It hides right at the family dinner table, perfectly concealed behind the comforting illusion of filial piety and peaceful, loving domestic dinners. It is a terrifying, stomach-churning realization that the gentle hands passing you a warm plate of food could be the exact same hands coldly calculating the exact cash value of your life insurance policy. If the desert body disposal theory is completely correct, and the cold-blooded killer truly dragged an 84-year-old woman into the unforgiving wilderness, which specific piece of digital evidence do you genuinely think will be the final straw that absolutely forces the killer to confess? Will it be the vehicle location data definitively proving the car drove out into the rocky wasteland? Will it be a deleted internet search history showing someone desperately looking for clever ways to permanently cover up a domestic homicide? Or will it be the cell phone records showing a fatal connection to the wrong tower at the exact wrong time? Let us discuss this together down in the comment section below. I genuinely want to carefully read your personal theories on exactly what specific, careless mistake will ultimately bring this entire house of cards violently crashing down. We are all patiently waiting for the final shoe to drop. Maybe in a few short weeks, a devastating grand jury indictment will finally be officially released to the general public, bringing the long-awaited justice that this deeply grieving family truly deserves. Or maybe the harsh reality is far more depressing. Maybe the vast, completely barren Arizona desert will simply swallow this dark truth forever, burying the terrible secrets beneath miles of sun, baked sand, and silent stones. We might never know the exact sequence of events that suddenly ended the long life of Nancy Guthrie on that freezing January night. But as we nervously look at the smiling family portraits and then back at the grainy surveillance video, we are left with one haunting question. In the end, who is wearing the mask? Thank you for joining me on this journey to the very end of this mystery case. If you enjoy analyzing the hidden aspects of these cases, please like and subscribe to the channel. See you on the next investigation journey.
We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her.
Investigation says that Tommaso Cioni, Annie P. Guthrie's husband, may be the prime suspect in this case, and Annie's vehicle has been towed, impounded, and is now in evidence.
It was here that the US news anchor's mother, Nancy, disappeared in the middle of the night from her home on the outskirts of Tucson in Arizona. Authorities believe she was kidnapped, but they don't know by who. Her blood found on the doorstep, one of the few clues that police are working with.
So picture this bombshell dropping just days into the case. Journalist Ashley Banfield goes on her podcast and says a high-level, impeccable law enforcement source told her that Tommaso Cioni, the son-in-law married to Nancy's daughter Annie, may be the prime suspect right now. Boom, that hits hard. But then, only a few hours later, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos steps up at a press conference and straight up calls that reporting reckless. He repeats it over and over. We have not identified a suspect or person of interest. Nobody. Zero. So you've got this massive clash, one side leaking a name, the other side shutting it down hard. The question that's been keeping me up at night is Tommaso Cioni really the guy they're quietly circling? Or has the court of public opinion already convicted him before the evidence even speaks? Look, I've spent the last several days digging through every official statement, every credible news report, the timeline the sheriff laid out, and all the little details that keep getting glossed over. This is what I've found so far. Okay, before we dive into the timeline, the searches, the ransom notes, or any of that heavy stuff, let's just pause for a second and talk about who Tommaso Cioni actually is. Because right now, if you've been scrolling through comments or headlines, you might think he's some shadowy figure lurking in the background of this nightmare. But the truth is, from everything I've pulled together from credible reports, LinkedIn profiles, old band bios, school posts, and family photos, this guy sounds like the most ordinary, low-key dad and husband you could imagine in a Tucson suburb. Tommaso Cioni is 50 years old, born in Italy, specifically a small town called San Giovanni Valdarno in Tuscany. Back in 1975, he moved to Tucson, Arizona in 2006 So he's been there almost 20 years now. That's basically half his adult life. He married Annie Guthrie, Nancy's oldest daughter and Savannah's big sister, around that same time, and they've got one son together. From what Annie has shared publicly over the years, their life looks pretty wholesome. Think family hikes in the desert, trips back to Italy to see relatives, picking berries on trails, making homemade pasta from scratch. Annie's Facebook page has these highlight reels, old photos of Tommaso standing in snow somewhere, or holding a handful of wild berries like he's proud of foraging them. Nothing flashy, just normal family moments. And Annie has called him her greatest teacher and a great manifester. You know, that positive, supportive vibe where someone believes in manifesting good things through mindset. She even said he writes poetry through his lifestyle. Sounds like the kind of guy who inspires people around him. Professionally, he's a teacher. Specifically, he's been at Busses Oro Valley School, a charter school in the Tucson area, for more than 15 years now. He teaches 6th grade science and AP biology. There's an old school Facebook post from around 2015 where they profiled him. He talked about loving how kids grow, from pre-teens into young adults. How he gets to share his passion for learning. He even joked that if he weren't teaching, he'd probably be a herpetologist. That's someone who studies reptiles and amphibians, like lizards. He mentioned studying lizards in his own bio on an Italian cultural site. I write when I get the chance. I study lizards. I play electric bass. I make homemade pasta. Simple, quirky interests. No red flags there, just a science guy who likes nature and cooking. And then there's the music side. He's the bass player and sometimes vocalist in a local indie rock band called Early Black. The band formed back in April 2007. Tommaso connected with the drummer Dominic Evans and guitarist Walter Gahn, Alves through Craigslist and newspaper ads. Classic Tucson scene stuff. They play post-punk, shoegaze, a bit grungy rock. They released an album called Life, Love, Murder years ago, gigged around local spots like Plush in Tucson. Even hit Phoenix and Flagstaff sometimes. The band's Reverb Nation page describes it all pretty straightforward, no drama. Just a group of guys making music on the side. Tommaso isn't touring the world or anything. It's a hobby band that still writes and plays locally when they can. So when you picture the son-in-law in a case like this, you probably don't imagine a guy who spends his days teaching kids about lizards and playing in a post-punk band. But that's exactly who Tommaso Cioni is. Which makes what happened next even more jarring. If you saw a guy like that in your own family, steady job, creative hobbies, family photos full of hikes and pasta nights, would you ever imagine him being dragged into something this dark? Drop your thoughts below. Seriously, I'm curious what your gut says before we get into the heavier parts. From there, everything shifted because of one night, January 31st, 2026. Alright, so now we get to the night everything changed, Saturday, January 31st, 2026. This is the part where the story goes from normal family evening to something went terribly wrong. And Tommaso Cioni ends up right in the middle of it. Not because he did anything flashy, but simply because he was the last one to see Nancy Guthrie alive and well. Let's walk through what we know from the official timeline the sheriff's office laid out. They even put up a graphic at a press conference on February 5th. It starts around 5:32 p.m. Nancy, who's 84 and doesn't drive much anymore, takes an Uber over to Annie and Tommaso's house in Tucson. That's her older daughter Annie, Savannah's big sister, and her husband Tommaso. They live pretty close, just a few miles away in the Catalina Foothills area. It's a typical family night, dinner, probably some games, or just hanging out, chatting. The kind of thing grandparents love. Nothing out of the ordinary shows up in any reports about that part. Then, later in the evening, Tommaso drives her back home. The exact time gets pinned down pretty tight by the garage door records The garage door opens at 9:48 p.m. when she arrives. Sheriff Chris Nanos said in multiple statements, including to the New York Times, that Tommaso made sure Nancy got inside safely before he left. The garage door closes 2 minutes later, at 9:50 p.m. That's the last confirmed moment anyone saw her or had contact with her. Tommaso drives off, and from there, the house goes quiet. At least, that's how it looked at first. But here's where it starts getting heavy. Early the next morning, Sunday, February 1st, things go sideways fast. Around 1:47 a.m., the doorbell camera at Nancy's house gets disconnected. Police confirmed that in the same press conference. Then, at 2:12 a.m., the system's motion detection picks up a person near the home. But because the camera was already offline and the footage overwrites itself without an active subscription, there's no video to look at. No faces, no car, nothing. Just a gap. When family checks on her later that morning, she doesn't show up for church, which sets off alarms. They go to the house around 11 a.m. By noon they've called 911. Officers arrive, and that's when they find the blood. Drops of it on the front porch. DNA testing later confirms it's Nancy's. The back door was propped open or left unlocked, depending on which report you read. But either way, signs of force or struggle. The sheriff says she was taken by force sometime after that 9:50 drop-off and before the family arrived the next day. So why does this put Tommaso at the center right away? Simple, he's the last known person to see her alive. He drove her home, waited to see her get inside, and left. That makes him the final point of contact before the hours of darkness where everything happened. In any missing person case, especially one that turns into a suspected abduction, investigators always start with the people closest, and the last person to see the victim is always going to get looked at hard. It's not personal, it's protocol. But here's the thing. Being the last person to see someone doesn't automatically make you guilty. It just makes you the first person everyone looks at. And that's exactly what started happening. The sheriff has repeated it over and over, no suspects, no persons of interest named. Yet the timeline keeps circling back to that drop-off. Tommaso told investigators he got her home safe, and the garage door records back him up on the timing. Still, those 4 hours between 9:50 p.m. and 1:47 a.m. are a black hole. No one knows what happened in Nancy's house during that window. Was there a knock at the door? Did someone she knew come by? Or did the drop-off itself hide something we don't see yet? If you were piecing this together as a detective, that last sighting would be your anchor point, the one solid fact before the chaos. But it also raises questions. Why did the camera get disconnected hours later? Why blood on the porch if she was supposedly safe inside? And why does the guy who says he walked her in become the name everyone whispers about? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Does the drop-off timeline feel too clean to you, or is it exactly what it seems, a normal ride home that ended with a nightmare starting after he left? I'm reading every one. Which brings us to what happened when police turned their attention to the family house next door. So now the story moves from that dark window after the drop-off straight to the family home, just a few miles away. Because once the blood was confirmed as Nancy's, and the abduction label stuck, investigators didn't waste time. They turned to the people closest to her, starting with Annie and Tommaso. And that's when things got really invasive, really fast. The searches at Annie and Tommaso's house weren't some surprise raid with battering rams and warrants. They were consented searches, meaning the couple said yes, let the detectives in, handed over what was asked. First one happened around February 7th or 8th, right in that window when the ransom notes started hitting the media. Police went through the place methodically, took photos of multiple rooms, collected evidence items, they won't say exactly what, even checked the septic tank out back. Yeah, you heard that right. They literally dug around in the septic system, looking for anything that might connect. That's not a casual check. That's the kind of thorough you do when you're ruling things in or out with zero room for doubt. There were follow-ups too, at least one more visit confirmed by local reporters who were parked outside. Neighbors saw the yellow tape, the unmarked cars, deputies coming and going. And then the rumor mill kicked in hard. People started saying Annie's car got impounded, towed away for forensic examination. That one spread like wildfire online. But here's the key. Neither the sheriff's office nor the FBI has ever confirmed it publicly. No press release, no statement saying, "We seized a vehicle." So right now it's just chatter. Could be true, could be exaggeration from someone who saw a tow truck nearby. Either way, it added fuel to the whispers. On top of the physical searches, Annie and Tommaso got hit with something else weird: fake ransom messages. Remember Derek Colella, the 42-year-old from Hawthorne, California, who got arrested by the FBI around February 5th for sending hoax ransom demands? Well, some of those bogus texts and notes went directly to Annie and Tommaso, pretending to be the real kidnapper, demanding money, giving fake deadlines. The feds say he admitted it after Miranda, that he was just exploiting the case for whatever twisted reason. But imagine getting those messages while your mother-in-law is missing and police are already in your house. That's a whole extra layer of chaos landing right on their doorstep. This is the part I couldn't get past at first. They're searching the daughter's house, not some strangers. It feels heavy. When your own kid's home gets turned upside down like that, even with consent, it changes the dynamic. The family isn't just grieving anymore. They're under a microscope. And because the house is only about 4 miles, maybe a 5 or 10-minute drive, from Nancy's place, that proximity makes everything feel closer, more personal, more suspicious to anyone looking from the outside. But let's be real for a second. In abduction cases, especially with vulnerable adults, investigators always start with family and close contacts. It's not optional, it's textbook. The last person to see her was Tommaso. The daughter lives nearby. Of course they're going to look there first, hard, and repeatedly until every corner is cleared. Consented searches actually speed things up, no fighting over warrants, no delays. Still, the optics are brutal. Yellow tape in your driveway, strangers photographing your kitchen, someone poking around your septic tank that doesn't scream. Routine. To most people. When police show up at your house multiple times and start digging through your septic tank, what does that actually tell you? Does it mean they think you did it? Or just that they have to check every possibility? What would you think if it was your house? Be straight with me in the comments. I'd really like to know how that would land for you. From there, the pressure didn't let up. Because while the searches were happening behind closed doors, a completely different storm was brewing out in public. One that put Tommaso's name front and center in a way the sheriff never did. Alright, so up until this point the investigation felt mostly contained. Police searches behind closed doors, family staying quiet, sheriff repeating the same careful lines at every briefing. Then February 4th, 2026, hits, and everything explodes into the open in a way nobody saw coming. That's when Ashley Banfield, the veteran journalist who's been covering crime for decades, now with her own show and podcast, drops what feels like a grenade. She's on her program, talking about the Nancy Guthrie case, and she says flat out that she has a source, a high-level, impeccable law enforcement source, who told her Tommaso Cioni may be the prime suspect right now. She doesn't hedge much. She lays it out. The son-in-law, the guy who drove Nancy home that night, is allegedly the one they're focusing on hardest. The clip spreads like crazy within hours. People screenshot it, share it, argue about it. Suddenly Tommaso's name isn't just floating in private speculation anymore. It's on a national platform, backed by what Banfield calls rock-solid inside info. And she doesn't back off when the pushback starts. The next day, she's doubling down, going on air again, defending the source, saying this isn't gossip. It's from someone who knows the case inside out. Even Meghan Kelly jumps in to support her, posting on social media that Banfield's reporting checks out with what she's hearing from her own contacts. Now you've got two big-name journalists essentially signaling the same thing. Look closer at the son-in-law. The internet does what the internet does. Comments sections light up, theories fly. People start digging into Tommaso's old band photos, his teaching job, anything they can find. It feels like the court of public opinion just handed down a verdict. But then Sheriff Chris Nanos steps to the podium at a press conference later that same day, February 4th or 5th, depending on the time zone, and shuts it down hard. He doesn't mince words. He calls the reporting reckless. Straight up reckless. He says it multiple times for emphasis, and then he repeats what he's been saying since day one: we have not identified a suspect or person of interest. Nobody. Not Tommaso, not anyone else. He stresses that they're following every lead, talking to everyone who knew Nancy, but no one has been named. No one has been targeted like that. It's a direct, point-by-point rebuttal aimed right at Banfield's claim. So now we've got two completely different stories running at the same time, one from an anonymous source feeding a seasoned reporter, and one from the guy actually running the investigation. Which one are we supposed to believe? On one hand, Banfield isn't some random blogger. She's got decades in this game, covered high-profile cases, built a reputation for getting sources to talk when others can't. If her contact really is high-level and impeccable, that carries weight. Anonymous sources aren't perfect, but they're how a lot of big breaks happen in true crime. At the same time, Sheriff Nanos is the one with the badge, the files, the forensics team. He's the one who has to answer in court if anything goes sideways. Calling something reckless isn't casual. That's him putting his own credibility on the line to push back. The timing makes it even messier. This all drops right as the searches at Annie and Tommaso's house are happening, right as those fake ransom texts from Kalela are landing. Public pressure is skyrocketing. If the sheriff stays silent, people say he's covering something up. If he pushes back too hard, it looks defensive. Either way, the damage is done. Tommaso's name is out there now, tied to prime suspect, in headlines that don't disappear. What gets me is how fast the shift happened. One day the focus is on ransom notes and proof of life demands. The next it's laser focused on the family again, specifically one person. And because the sheriff won't confirm or deny specifics beyond his blanket statement, the vacuum gets filled with more speculation. If you're following along at home, does Banfield's source feel credible enough to outweigh the sheriff's denial? Or does the official, no suspects, line carry more weight because it's on record from the top cop? Hit the comments, tell me which side you're leaning toward right now. I'm still turning this one over in my head. And that clash didn't just stay in the news cycle. It changed how people looked at every update that came after. Okay, so by now the name Tommaso Cioni is everywhere, and once that happens, every little detail about him or his life starts getting pulled apart like it's evidence in a courtroom. People aren't waiting for the police to connect anything, they're doing it themselves online, in comment sections, on podcasts. And a few things keep coming up over and over as the so-called red flags. Let's go through them one by one, because some of these feel like they could mean something big, and others feel like they're just noise filling the silence. First up, that power of attorney document. Somehow, nobody's really sure how it leaked. A durable power of attorney pops up online showing Tommaso had given Annie legal authority over his affairs years ago. It's not new, it's dated way back, probably when they were setting up their life together or dealing with some routine estate stuff. But the timing of it surfacing right after Nancy goes missing. Brutal. People see it and immediately jump to money motives, maybe financial trouble, maybe debts, maybe something tied to Nancy's assets. The speculation runs wild: gambling debts, hidden money problems, the classic, follow the money. angle. Thing is, there's zero evidence from any official source that Tommaso or Annie had money issues, let alone anything criminal. No bankruptcy filings, no court records of debts popping up in the public searches I've done. It's just a standard legal paper that got weaponized by bad timing and the internet's imagination. Then there are the ransom notes themselves. The real ones, or at least the ones the police and FBI are treating as potentially legitimate, keep getting sent to media outlets. First to the local station KJUM, then to TMZ, with demands for $6 million in Bitcoin, deadlines that come and go, threats if nobody pays. What's weird? Almost none of them go straight to the family. The only messages Annie and Tommaso got were the fake ones from that guy, Derek Colella, who got arrested. The supposed real kidnapper isn't calling the daughter or son-in-law directly, isn't texting Savannah, isn't dropping proof of life to the people who would pay fastest. Instead, it's all public theater through news channels. That raises eyebrows. Why broadcast to the world instead of pressuring the family privately? It either means the kidnapper wants maximum attention, or it means something else entirely. And don't forget the timeline gaps we talked about last time. Tommaso drops Nancy off around 9:50 p.m., garage closes, he leaves. Next confirmed activity is the doorbell camera getting disconnected at 1:47 a.m., then motion detected at 2:12 a.m., with no video because of the overwrite. That's roughly 4 hours of nothing. No neighbor reports, no doorbell rings caught elsewhere, no phone pings if Nancy had her cell on her. Those blank hours feel huge. Plenty of time for someone to show up, for something to go wrong, for a plan to unfold. But the police haven't filled them in publicly, so every theory rushes in to plug the holes. Finally, that one line from Sheriff Nanos that gets twisted every single time he says it. Everybody's still a suspect. He dropped it early on, probably meaning standard procedure. Nobody's ruled out yet because the investigation is wide open. But people hear it and think, that includes Tommaso, that means he's still in the crosshairs. The sheriff has clarified multiple times that it doesn't mean we suspect everyone equally. It just means no one's cleared until the case moves forward. Still, the phrase sticks like glue and fuels the narrative that the family, especially the son-in-law, is under heavy suspicion, even if the sheriff won't say it outright. What struck me here was how quickly people connected dots that the police themselves say aren't even dots yet. One legal document from years ago, plus a quiet drop-off, plus media silence equals motive and opportunity in the public's mind. But strip away the speculation, and what's left is mostly gaps, things we don't know, not things we do know. If you saw a power of attorney document surface right after something like this, would you think it was suspicious? Or just bad timing? Be honest. Drop it in the comments. I'm trying to figure out where the line is between reasonable questions and jumping to conclusions. Because the more these red flags get amplified, the harder it gets to see what's actually there versus what's being projected onto the case. And that's exactly why the next layer matters. Figuring out whether all this scrutiny is standard procedure, or if it's pointing somewhere the sheriff won't admit yet. All right, let's take a breath and zoom out for a minute. We've gone through the drop-off timeline, the searches at the daughter's house, the septic tank checks, the fake ransom texts, the power of attorney leak, the 4-hour gaps, and that massive media clash where one reporter says prime suspect and the sheriff says no suspects at all. Now the big question hanging over everything is what Tommaso Cioni is going through, just the normal grind of a close family member investigation. Or is there something extra here? Some quiet signal that the police are digging deeper than they're admitting. First, look at what's actually on the table from official sources. As of right now, and this is straight from the sheriff's repeated pressers and the FBI's updates, there is no indictment. No arrest warrant. No charges filed against Tommaso or anyone in the family. No vehicle has been publicly named or confirmed as seized, even though rumors about Annie's car keep swirling. The searches were consented, not forced with warrants flying. That matters. When investigators get consent, it usually means the people inside are cooperating, not fighting back. And Annie and Tommaso have stayed low profile the whole time, no dramatic interviews, no social media outbursts, no lawyers blasting the media. They've let police in, handed over what was asked, and kept their heads down. That's not the behavior you typically see from someone who's actively hiding something big. Now compare that to how these cases usually play out when family is involved. In almost every high-profile missing person turned abduction case with an elderly or vulnerable victim, the inner circle gets hit hardest and first. Think about the Gabby Petito case. Brian Laundrie was the boyfriend, the last person with her, and investigators swarmed his family home early. Or the Delphi murders. They looked at family and close contacts before widening the net. Or even older ones like the Lassie Peterson disappearance. Scott was under the microscope from day one, because he was the husband, the last to see her. It's not bias, it's statistics. Most abductions or homicides involving vulnerable adults involve someone known to the victim, family, caregiver, neighbor. So police have to clear the people closest before they can honestly say they've ruled out the obvious. Multiple consented searches. Checking the septic system. Taking photos of rooms. That's textbook thoroughness when the victim's own house is only 4 miles away and the last sighting was a family member dropping her off. The sheriff's language backs this up too. Every time he speaks, he stresses no suspects, no persons of interest identified. But he also says things like, "We're following all leads," and "Everybody's still a suspect," in the broad sense, meaning nobody's fully cleared until the puzzle fits. He hasn't singled Tommaso out, hasn't leaked anything to contradict his own no-suspect stance, hasn't called a special briefing to say, "We're focusing here." If there was something more, real probable cause, a smoking gun in that house, you'd expect at least a warrant, an arrest, or some public escalation. None of that has happened. At the same time, the intensity feels heavier than average. Multiple visits to the same house. Digging in the septic tank, that's not routine for every family check. That's when they're looking for something specific they can't ignore. And the way the media storm landed, right as those searches were happening, it creates this feedback loop where public pressure makes the family look more suspicious, even if the police aren't saying it. So is it standard? Mostly yes. The protocol fits. The cooperation fits. The lack of charges fits. But is there something more bubbling under the surface? The repeated searches and the silence around certain details leave just enough room to wonder if they're sitting on a piece they can't share yet. At this point, I started questioning everything I thought I knew about how these investigations really work. I always figured if they really suspected someone close, you'd see handcuffs or at least a named person of interest pretty quick. But here, it's all quiet pressure, consented doors opening, and a big public "no suspects" sign. Maybe that's smart police work, don't tip your hand. Or maybe it's because there's genuinely nothing pointing at Tommaso beyond proximity and bad optics. Either way, weighing it all, the evidence we can see leans towards standard procedure with extra scrutiny because of who he is to Nancy. No bombshells, no smoking guns released. Just the slow, grinding process of elimination. But that leaves us right on the edge of the unknown, and that's exactly where this case has stayed for over a week now. Which brings us to the final piece, what all this means when you step back and look at the whole picture. So here we are. We've walked the whole path together, step by step, from the quiet life of a 50-year-old biology teacher and bass player in a local indie band, to the guy who drove his mother-in-law home after a family dinner and became the last person to see her alive. From the blood on the porch and the disconnected doorbell camera in those dark, early morning hours, to the yellow tape going up at his own house just 4 miles away. From consented searches that dug into septic tanks and snapped photos of everyday rooms, to fake ransom texts landing in his inbox while the real ones played out on TV screens. From a journalist dropping the words, "prime suspect," based on an impeccable anonymous source, to the sheriff calling it reckless and repeating "no suspects, no persons of interest," over and over like a mantra. And through it all, no indictment, no arrest, no named vehicle, no public smoking gun, just a family cooperating quietly while the world speculates louder every day. The journey started with Tommaso looking like the most ordinary guy you could picture: hikes in the desert, homemade pasta, teaching kids about lizards, strumming bass in a post-punk outfit that never quite broke big. Then one night changed everything, and suddenly every gap in the timeline, every routine legal document, every standard investigative move got reframed as suspicious. The public latched on fast because that's what happens when a case goes viral and answers stay scarce. But strip away the headlines and the hot takes, and what's left is still an open investigation with no one officially charged, no one officially cleared, and a vulnerable 84-year-old woman still missing. A few things stick with me as real lessons from digging into this. Not preachy ones, just patterns that keep showing up in cases like these. First, tiny details and rotten timing can explode into what looks like hard evidence when thousands of eyes are watching. A power of attorney paper from years ago surfaces at the worst possible moment, and boom, suddenly it's motive. Second, real investigations often have to stay quiet to protect leads, preserve evidence, avoid tipping off whoever might be out there. But that silence creates a vacuum, and rumors rush in to fill it every single time. Third, when you've got anonymous sources whispering one thing to reporters, and the people with the badge saying the exact opposite on camera, you have to ask yourself who carries more weight in the long run, the leak that feels juicy, or the official line that has to stand up in court someday. That's the tension this whole thing lives in right now. And it's why I want to hear from you. What do you think is really going on with Tommaso? Is he quietly being targeted because the pieces fit too neatly around him? Or is he just caught in the crossfire of a case that's so public and so heartbreaking that everyone needs someone to blame while we wait? Drop your own theories, your gut feelings, whatever angle you've been turning over. No wrong answers here, just share what stands out to you after walking through it all. This whole thing has left me with one big question that I still can't answer, and maybe none of us can right now. In a case where the police keep saying there are no suspects, why does it feel like the whole world has already picked one? What do you think? Is Tommaso just collateral damage in a very public nightmare, or is there something we're all still missing? Drop your thoughts below. I'll be reading them. For 3 weeks, almost nobody believed the official story. The idea that a woman who is 84 years old was randomly taken in a botched burglary or a ransom kidnapping just felt completely wrong to the public. People were highly skeptical from the very beginning. But then, on day 25, a sudden convoy of armored black FBI vehicles raided the crime scene. That massive raid completely shattered the original narrative. The authorities are absolutely not looking for a common thief. They are actively hunting down a dangerous stalker. This leads to a terrifying question. But what if the target was never the mother, but the famous daughter sitting on national television every morning? I have spent the last few weeks digging into the FBI search warrants, reading the police reports, and analyzing the recent raid. And what I found changes the entire motive of this bizarre criminal case. For over 3 weeks, the street outside Nancy Guthrie's home in Oro Valley had settled into a grim routine. The media tents were already pitched. The exhausted reporters were doing their daily stand-up broadcasts, and the whole quiet neighborhood was just waiting for a major break in the criminal case. But on day 25, everything changed. Without any prior warning, the local authorities enacted a strict new ordinance. They suddenly ordered the entire press pool to pack up and leave. A mandatory parking ban was enforced across the entire neighborhood, coming with a hefty $250 fine for anyone who dared to leave their vehicle on the street. They brought in the Department of Transportation to drop barricades and physically block off the lanes. They were clearing the stage, and they wanted absolutely no uninvited eyes on that house. Once the street was cleared of the lingering cameras and the curious onlookers, the real operation began. A convoy of darkly tinted vehicles rolled into the quiet neighborhood. These were not just uniformed patrol officers doing a routine wellness check. I am talking about top-tier federal agents. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially taken over the physical scene, and they brought local Pima County homicide detectives right alongside them. When homicide detectives show up in force nearly a month after a disappearance, the tone shifts completely. It tells us that the investigation has escalated from a simple search and rescue into something much darker and much more complex. The perimeter was secured tightly, and the agents began a meticulous, grid search of the property. They were looking for anything that might have been overlooked during the initial sweep weeks ago. Every single blade of grass seemed to be under their microscope. So, let us look at exactly what these highly trained agents were focusing on. A large group of them gathered right at the front entryway of the house. If you have been following this case from the very beginning, you know exactly why that specific spot is so critical. The front door is where the initial investigators found the blood evidence on the very first night. The agents were scrutinizing the porch, the doorway, and the immediate surrounding area. They were not just taking a quick look, they were behaving as if they were trying to reconstruct a violent struggle that happened 25 days ago. They moved from the front of the main house and began methodically walking the perimeter, checking the side yards, and eventually making their way toward the back patio. The tension in the air was incredibly thick. You could tell that the agents knew the whole world was watching their every single move, yet they remained entirely silent and focused. What happened next, though, is the detail that completely stopped me in my tracks. While the agents were walking the grounds, a single, completely unmarked black sports utility vehicle slowly approached the property. Unlike the other federal vehicles that parked out on the street or in the driveway, this specific vehicle did not stop outside. The garage door of Nancy Guthrie's home opened up just enough to let the vehicle slip inside. The driver pulled the sports utility vehicle straight into the dark garage, and the heavy door slammed shut immediately behind it. The heavily tinted windows made it utterly impossible to see who was sitting inside the cabin. Once that garage door closed, the investigators moved their attention to the guest house located in the backyard. They spent a significant amount of time circling that secondary structure, analyzing every possible entry and exit point. They examined the windows and the doors with extreme precision. But my mind kept going back to that black sports utility vehicle hidden away inside the garage. The extreme level of secrecy surrounding that specific arrival was highly unusual. They went through a massive amount of trouble, kicking out the media and setting up barricades, just to ensure that whoever was inside that vehicle could enter the crime scene completely unseen by the public. This was a heavily coordinated move designed to protect someone's identity. It makes you wonder if they had someone cooperating with them, someone who knows what happened in those dark hours. They are keeping their cards very close to their chest right now. Why hide someone in the garage on day 25? Do you think they brought a suspect or a key witness? Let me know what you guys think down below. When the authorities shifted their focus, the entire investigation took a massive turn toward the digital world. Savannah Guthrie is undeniably one of the most recognizable faces on morning television today. Millions of people invite her into their living rooms every single morning. Because of that massive platform, she receives countless emails, letters, and social media messages. Now, the Federal Bureau of Investigation is completely tearing through her personal and professional digital life. The agents are meticulously reading through piles of fan mail, filtering through direct messages, and digging deep into her hidden email folders. They are no longer looking for a random local criminal. They are desperately hunting for a crazed fan. They are searching for that one specific person who crossed the dangerous line from being a dedicated daily viewer to becoming a severely unhinged fanatic. At this point, I started questioning everything we thought we knew about the motive. If this terrible crime was truly just a standard home invasion gone wrong, the local police would simply be checking local pawn shop records or interrogating known burglars in the immediate area. If this was a traditional kidnapping for a quick financial payout, we would have seen a verified ransom demand by now. But we have not seen any of those typical things. Instead, the federal agents are laser-focused on the daughter's massive television fan base. The reason this matters is it completely shifts the timeline and the physical geographic focus of this entire case. Let us rewind the clock a little bit. A few months ago, Savannah traveled back to her hometown of Tucson, Arizona. She went there to film a very public, heartwarming television segment for her morning show, heavily featuring her elderly mother, Nancy. During that highly publicized trip, the two of them visited various local spots around town, including a very popular Mexican restaurant located right in the heart of the city. It was framed as a beautiful mother and daughter bonding moment, proudly broadcasted to millions of viewers across the entire country. But we have to ask a truly terrifying question right now. What if someone was watching them that day, not just through a television screen, but physically in person? We know for a fact that federal investigators recently went back to that exact Mexican restaurant in Tucson. They have been quietly interviewing the waitstaff, sitting down with the shift managers, and questioning anyone who was working during that specific television shoot several months ago. The detectives are asking them very specific, highly targeted questions. They want to know if anyone in the crowd was acting strange that afternoon. Did any customer linger around their table a little too long? Was there a random person taking unauthorized photographs or giving off a genuinely creepy, unsettling vibe while Savannah and Nancy were just trying to enjoy their lunch? The investigators are actively trying to piece together if a stalker physically tracked them during that hometown visit. In other words, the authorities are deeply exploring the terrifying possibility that this kidnapper has been completely fixated on Savannah for many months, or perhaps even for many years. They are trying to figure out if that highly public hometown visit was the exact moment the stalker realized just how physically vulnerable Nancy actually was. Did this obsessed fan see Nancy as a strategic pawn? Was taking the mother simply a twisted, horrific way to force an intimate connection with the famous daughter? Fame usually comes with a very heavy, unseen price, but absolutely nobody ever expects their own elderly mother to be the one who has to pay it. The chilling idea that Nancy was essentially turned into helpless bait simply because she went out to eat a meal with her famous daughter is absolutely heartbreaking. It changes the narrative completely. This was never a random crime of fleeting opportunity. This was a highly calculated crime of deep, dark obsession. The person who broke into that house did not want Nancy's television set, and they certainly did not care about her jewelry or her bank accounts. The stalker wanted Savannah's undivided attention. They wanted to force a famous television anchor to look directly at them, to speak directly to them, and they knew exactly which loved one they had to take to make that sick fantasy become a reality. This entire situation proves just how terrifying public life can truly become when a deeply unstable individual decides to blur the boundary between fantasy and real life. When you watch the videos that Savannah Guthrie has been posting online and broadcasting on national television over the last 25 days, something feels incredibly specific about them. If your elderly mother was violently taken from her home in the middle of the dark night, your very first instinct would probably be absolute, unfiltered, and blind rage. You would want to scream directly at the camera. You would want to threaten the person who did this. You would want to demand that they return your loved one immediately or face the ultimate consequences. But Savannah is not doing any of that. Her tone is remarkably soft. It is gentle, pleading, and overwhelmingly empathetic. She speaks as if she is trying to comfort the very person who broke into her mother's house. She is humanizing herself, humanizing her mother, and almost speaking to this unseen kidnapper like they are a misguided friend who just made a terrible mistake. And there is yet another very glaring detail. In the very first video released to the public, the siblings stood together. But ever since that very first day, Savannah has been standing completely alone. She is the only family member delivering these messages. Why is she the solitary face of this incredibly desperate public campaign? To understand this, we have to look through the lens of a professional. Former Federal Bureau of Investigation hostage negotiator Phil Andrew recently provided a chilling analysis of Savannah's public behavior. According to Andrew, every single word Savannah says, and exactly how she says it, is highly calculated. She is strictly following a psychological script designed by federal behavioral analysts. They know exactly who they are dealing with, and they know that aggressive threats will only put Nancy in greater danger. Because of that, the federal investigative team had to narrow the official messenger down to just one single person. They needed a single, consistent voice to establish a direct line of emotional communication. If the kidnapper is truly a stalker obsessed with Savannah, seeing her brother or other relatives on the screen would only aggravate him. He does not care about them. He only cares about her. Which means, Savannah is not just broadcasting a general plea to the American public, she is actually having a direct, one-on-one conversation with a deeply disturbed individual. Phil Andrew pointed out that this specific type of stalker likely suffers from a psychological condition known as erotomania. This is a severe delusion where a person genuinely believes that another person, usually someone with a higher social status or public profile, is secretly in love with them. In the twisted mind of the stalker, this is not a violent kidnapping. To him, he might genuinely believe he is rescuing Nancy, or that taking the mother is simply the necessary first step to finally being united with Savannah. He operates in a completely alternate reality. If Savannah were to show anger or disgust, it would shatter his fragile delusion, which could immediately trigger a violent, unpredictable reaction against the 84-year-old captive. The federal agents are forcing Savannah to carefully nurture the stalker's delusion just enough to keep her mother alive. She has to project an aura of understanding and emotional availability. She has to make the deranged kidnapper feel heard, emotionally validated, and oddly respected. When you really sit back and think about the psychological weight of that strategy, it is absolutely horrifying. We have all been so focused on the physical abduction of Nancy that we missed the psychological hostage situation playing out right in front of our eyes. The real victim of this intense psychological manipulation is Savannah herself. She is being forced to suppress her own devastating trauma, her natural anger, and her crippling fear, all to gently coddle the ego of the monster who stole her mother. She has to look directly into the camera lens every single day and pretend to show grace to a psychopath. Every breath she takes on television is a high-stakes negotiation for her mother's life. It is a truly sickening burden for anyone to carry, let alone having to do it while the entire country closely analyzes your every single public move. It requires a massive level of strict emotional control that most of us simply do not possess. If you knew a deranged fan took your mom, could you keep your composure and speak to them with empathy on national TV? What would you do? For the first few weeks of this investigation, the authorities were completely paralyzed by a frustrating lack of physical evidence. The local police and the federal agents scoured the entire property in Oro Valley, but they came up empty-handed every single time. There were no usable fingerprints left behind on the doorframes. The DNA samples extracted from a stray glove found 2 miles away from the house did not trigger any matches within the national database. There were no clear tire tracks in the driveway, and absolutely no witnesses came forward with a description of a getaway vehicle. The perpetrator was essentially a ghost who managed to slip into the house of an elderly woman and vanish into the dark night without leaving a single biological trace behind. The traditional forensic route was completely dead, leading many people to wonder if this was the work of a highly trained professional. But, as we all know, we live in a digital age where it is nearly impossible to move through a modern neighborhood without leaving some kind of electronic footprint. Even if you cover your face and wear gloves, the cameras are always watching. Nancy Guthrie had a Nest doorbell camera installed at her front door. Initially, the investigators hit a massive brick wall with this device. It turned out that Nancy had not been paying for the premium cloud storage subscription service. Because of that minor oversight, the camera was not actively recording and saving high-definition video clips to an easily accessible account. The local detectives initially thought this crucial piece of digital security was completely useless. They assumed the footage was gone forever, lost to the void because of an expired subscription plan. And then, the federal investigators decided to bypass the local hardware and go straight to the top. They obtained the necessary legal warrants and reached out directly to Google, the parent company that owns and operates the Nest security ecosystem. The tech giant's engineers dug deep into their back-end servers, hoping to retrieve any fragmented data or unsaved cache files that might have been temporarily pinged by the camera's motion sensors. Against all odds, the tech team actually managed to recover a single, chilling still frame. The authorities finally had a visual of their suspect. The image showed a man standing right on Nancy's front porch. He was wearing a heavy jacket, gloves, a backpack, and a ski mask that completely obscured his facial features. At first glance, everyone assumed this haunting photograph was captured on the actual night of the abduction, which occurred on February 1st. It made perfect logical sense. But when the digital forensics team finally managed to isolate and verify the metadata attached to that specific image file, they uncovered a detail that completely changed the psychological profile of the suspect. The photograph was not taken on February 1st. The digital timestamp revealed that the image was actually captured on January 11th. That was nearly a full month before Nancy was taken from her bed. The masked man had been standing right outside her front door weeks before he finally decided to strike. What struck me here was the chilling patience of this guy. He wasn't looking for a quick score. He was hunting. A common burglar looking to steal jewelry or prescription medication does not perform a physical stakeout for an entire month. A random opportunistic criminal does not stand on a well-lit porch wearing a ski mask just to test the motion sensors and walk away. This behavior is the absolute hallmark of a highly dedicated, deeply obsessed stalker. He was meticulously studying his environment. He wanted to know her exact daily routine. He needed to figure out what time she went to sleep, how the lighting shifted across the front yard, and exactly how long it took for the neighborhood to go completely quiet. He learned the blind spots. This piece of digital evidence solidifies the terrifying theory that Nancy was carefully targeted as part of a much larger, darker obsession. The kidnapper spent almost 30 days stalking an 84-year-old woman, treating her home like a hunting ground. He was patiently waiting for the perfect, undisturbed moment to execute his twisted master plan. He knew her vulnerabilities. He knew she lived alone and could not fight back. The level of calculated evil required to stand in the freezing cold shadows and watch an elderly mother sleep through a window is difficult to comprehend. Let us take all of this psychological profiling and apply it directly to the timeline of February 1st, the actual night of the abduction. When investigators mapped out the digital footprint of that evening, they found a massive, terrifying gap in the sequence of events. The security camera at the front door was completely disabled at a very specific time. However, the internal monitoring system for Nancy Guthrie's medical pacemaker did not lose its connection and flatline until exactly 41 minutes later. There is a 41-minute void where the intruder was inside that house with an 84-year-old woman. If you look at the statistics for a standard home invasion, a typical burglar is in and out of a property in under 10 minutes. They want to grab the jewelry, find the cash, and disappear before the police arrive. Even a professional kidnapping crew aiming for a quick financial payout will breach the doors, secure the target, and extract them in less than 5 minutes. Speed is their ultimate weapon. But this intruder did not rush. He stayed inside that house for almost 3/4 of an hour. What in the world was happening during those 41 minutes? If we look at this through the lens of the stalker theory, those 41 minutes start to make a chilling kind of sense. A man suffering from severe erotomania does not just want to steal a person, he wants to be understood. He likely spent that time talking to Nancy. He might have been pacing the room, explaining his deeply twisted delusions and trying to convince this terrified mother that he and Savannah share a profound, cosmic connection. He might have been forcing her to look at photographs or read letters he had written. To him, he was not committing a violent felony. He was introducing himself to his future mother-in-law. Meanwhile, the outside world was being completely distracted by a very different kind of narrative. In the frantic days following the disappearance, the family received terrifying text messages demanding a massive payment in Bitcoin in exchange for Nancy's safe return. The media went into an absolute frenzy, assuming this was a classic ransom situation. The authorities aggressively tracked the digital footprint of those messages all the way to a man named Derek Colella in Los Angeles, California. They raided his location and arrested him on federal extortion charges. The problem is, the entire Bitcoin demand was nothing more than a cruel, opportunistic hoax. Colella had absolutely nothing to do with the actual kidnapping. He was just a sick individual sitting behind a computer screen, watching the news coverage, and trying to exploit a family's ultimate nightmare for a quick cryptocurrency payday. The Federal Bureau of Investigation confirmed that the messages from Los Angeles were completely disconnected from the person who actually walked into that house in Oro Valley. This revelation brings us to the most unsettling truth of this entire investigation. The real kidnapper, the invisible phantom who stood on the porch on January 11th and waited in the shadows on February 1st, has never asked for a single dime. He left the valuable items behind in the house. He did not empty her bank accounts. He does not want the family's wealth. He does not care about the $1 million reward. Money is completely irrelevant to his mission. When you realize that the perpetrator has zero financial motivation, the reality of the situation becomes infinitely more dangerous. You can negotiate with a greedy criminal. You can drop a bag of cash at a designated location and get your loved one back. But how do you negotiate with a phantom who only wants to possess another human being? How do you bargain with a man whose only currency is absolute obsession? He did not take Nancy for leverage. He took her to force a permanent emotional bridge between himself and Savannah. This lack of a rational motive is exactly why the authorities are treating this with such extreme caution. They are dealing with a completely unpredictable individual who has absolutely nothing to lose right now. Every single minute that ticks by adds to the mounting dread. Just think about the sheer psychological terror of being trapped in a room with a man completely detached from reality for almost an entire hour before being forced into the dark night. Do you think the stalker spent those 41 minutes trying to convince Nancy of his delusion? How do you read that timeline? While the Federal Behavioral Analysis Unit is busy diving deep into the dark psychology of a potential stalker, the local law enforcement strategy on the ground is becoming increasingly confusing. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is quietly tracking digital shadows, but the local authorities are loudly building walls. At the same time, the Pima County Sheriff is taking incredibly aggressive steps to completely shut out the outside world. Instead of utilizing the massive national attention to their advantage, they are pushing the media as far away as possible. They established a strict perimeter, threatened reporters with a $250 parking fine, and essentially demanded that the public stop looking so closely at the physical crime scene. You would naturally think that after 25 days, with absolutely no solid physical leads, the local police would welcome any qualified assistance they could possibly get. That brings us to the United Cajun Navy. This is a highly respected, professional volunteer search and rescue organization. They deployed a specialized team to Tucson, fully equipped and ready to work. They brought advanced thermal imaging drones. They brought highly trained search and rescue dogs. They brought subject matter experts who know exactly how to coordinate massive ground operations. Their primary target was the extensive network of large flash flood drainage tunnels running directly beneath the city and the surrounding foothills. These dark, concrete tunnels are completely empty right now because there has been no recent rain, making them an ideal, hidden location to stash evidence or hold a captive. The United Cajun Navy did not just want to run blindly into the desert. Their incident commander clearly stated they wanted to operate strictly under the command and control of local law enforcement so they would not accidentally contaminate any potential crime scenes. They repeatedly reached out to the sheriff to present a comprehensive operational plan. The response they received was absolute, deafening silence. The sheriff completely ignored their emails and phone calls. They asked for just 5 or 10 minutes of dialogue, and they were entirely shut out. The thing is, rejecting highly trained, free assistance in the middle of a stalled, high-profile kidnapping investigation makes absolutely no logical sense. When you are standing at a dead end, you usually accept all the professional boots on the ground you can possibly gather. Are the local authorities simply overwhelmed by the sheer volume of incoming tips? Or is this a matter of territorial pride and department ego getting in the very way of finding an 84-year-old woman? Because the local authorities refused to authorize a coordinated search of those underground tunnels, independent journalists actually had to climb down into the drainage system themselves just to see if there was any obvious sign of Nancy. They walked through the massive, echoing concrete pipes, finding nothing but the abandoned camps of local homeless individuals. It is incredibly frustrating to watch a specialized search and rescue team sit completely idle in a parking lot, waiting for a simple phone call that never comes while an elderly mother remains missing. The stark contrast here is deeply unsettling. On one side, you have the federal agents hunting an invisible stalker through cyberspace. On the other side, you have the local sheriff aggressively guarding an empty house and refusing to let professional volunteers search the physical terrain. It creates a suffocating atmosphere where the investigation feels entirely stalled. Time is the ultimate enemy in any abduction, and wasting precious daylight due to a lack of communication is a tragedy in itself. This must change now. As the days relentlessly marched on, the crushing weight of the unknown began to take an unimaginable toll on the family. We reached day 24, a tragic milestone that absolutely nobody ever wanted to see. That's when, in a desperate and heart-wrenching attempt to finally break the suffocating silence, Savannah Guthrie released a video message directly to the American public. She officially announced a massive family reward of up to $1 million for any verifiable information directly leading to the safe recovery of her missing mother. From there, the overall tone of the entire investigation noticeably shifted from a hopeful rescue mission into a painfully realistic, grim acceptance of reality. Savannah looked directly into the camera lens, her eyes completely filled with absolute sorrow, and she spoke words that broke the hearts of millions of dedicated viewers across the entire nation. She bravely admitted that it would truly take a massive miracle to find her mother alive at this extremely late stage. She said, with a quietly trembling voice, that she absolutely still believed in miracles, but then she slowly added the most devastating sentence of all. She stated, "She may have already gone home to the Lord." Hearing a daughter publicly accept the very real possibility of her beloved mother's death is absolutely chilling to witness. What I found was, this profoundly heartbreaking realization did not actually come from an official briefing provided by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. According to highly trusted insider sources, this incredibly bleak conclusion was ultimately drawn by the grieving family members themselves. They looked closely at the terrifying facts of the case. They heavily considered the severe medical conditions of an 84-year-old woman who desperately relies on a medical pacemaker to survive. They realized the horrifying truth of the current situation, which tells us the people who love her the absolute most are actively preparing their broken hearts for the absolute worst possible outcome. The entire criminal investigation is right now moving incredibly and terrifyingly close to unfortunately becoming a completely frozen, entirely cold case. This devastating tragedy firmly forces every single one of us to confront a deeply uncomfortable lesson about our modern digital age. We urgently have to talk about the incredibly dark, highly dangerous side of absolute fame and the terrifying psychological reality of parasocial relationships. In our current television society, a morning anchor is not just a person simply reading the daily news. To millions of lonely, deeply isolated individuals sitting at home, that famous person gradually becomes a trusted personal friend, a daily intimate companion, or even a highly twisted romantic fixation. That intense public attention certainly brings massive professional success, incredible financial wealth, and sweeping global recognition. However, it also creates incredibly dangerous, totally fatal blind spots. You can build a heavily guarded, highly secure fortress around a famous celebrity, but their elderly, vulnerable relatives living quiet lives in peaceful residential neighborhoods often become the absolute easiest targets for severely deranged psychopaths. The massive fame of the successful daughter ultimately became the exact very thing that placed a giant, completely invisible target right on the fragile back of the unsuspecting mother. Looking at everything I've gathered, the raid, the ignored ransom, the timeline, my gut tells me this won't be solved by DNA. It's going to take someone slipping up. Someone bragging at a bar. The digital trails have gone completely cold, and the physical forensic evidence is practically non-existent at this point. We are relying entirely on the fragile hope of simple human error. We desperately need the kidnapper's former romantic partner to suddenly remember a very strange passing comment. We need an observant bartender to overhear a drunken, boastful confession late at night. The perfect crime only stays perfectly hidden until the arrogant criminal decides to finally open their mouth. I want to hear your theories. Take a look at this stalker theory and the sudden FBI raid. What detail do you think the investigators are missing? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We absolutely must keep actively talking about this deeply unsettling mystery, because continuous public pressure might literally be the only investigative tool we have left to finally shake the absolute truth loose from the terrifying darkness. The $1 million reward is on the table. The FBI is watching the shadows. But tonight, A house in Oro Valley sits empty, and somewhere out there, the invisible man is still watching. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate your time and support. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the case, please like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Your engagement helps this channel grow. Stay safe out there, and I will see you next time.
And then you have the blood that investigators say belongs to Nancy that was found on the front steps of her home. What we're learning potentially about that blood that the untrained eye may miss.
As the mystery into where Nancy Guthrie is, I've begun doing some research into the Catalina foothills. And I found these two robberies from September of 2025. There was one arrest made, the female who you see in the next video, with an Amazon package. And I couldn't help but think of Nancy's.
We have all seen that single chilling image on our screens. The masked figure wearing an Ozark Trail backpack reaching for the camera. Because he is the only person captured on tape, public attention naturally focuses entirely on him. But the physical crime scene tells a completely different story. Two crucial pieces of forensic evidence shatter the idea of a solitary mastermind. First, the 90-degree blood drops found inside the house. Second, the mixed DNA recovered directly from the bedroom. So, here is the real question we must ask. If the guy on the camera was busy dismantling the doorbell outside in the dark, then who exactly left their DNA inside the house and physically lifted Nancy away? What I found was, after digging through forensic reports, DNA expert analysis, and official police files, that this conclusion is not some wild conspiracy theory. It is the undeniable truth now. Let us take a step back and look at the physical reality of what happened that night. When we talk about a kidnapping, we often imagine a chaotic struggle, a forceful extraction, or someone being dragged away into the dark. But to understand why the lone wolf theory falls apart instantly, we have to look closely at the two people supposedly involved in this midnight encounter. First, we need to talk about Nancy Guthrie. Nancy was 84 years old. She was not someone who could easily fight off an intruder, but more importantly, she was not someone who could easily be moved. According to official statements from law enforcement and her own family, Nancy relied on a pacemaker to keep her heart beating properly. Her mobility was severely compromised. In fact, she could not walk more than 45 meters on her own without needing assistance. Think about that distance for a second. 45 meters. That is roughly half the length of a standard football field. It is essentially the distance from her bedroom, down the hallway, through the living room, and out to the edge of her driveway. If you forced her to walk faster than her normal, slow pace, she would likely stumble or collapse. She was frail, vulnerable, and completely dependent on her daily medication and medical devices. So, if she did not leave that house under her own power, she had to be carried or physically supported every single step of the way. Now, let us shift focus to the man on the doorbell camera. The media has scrutinized every pixel of that footage, and what we see is a man loaded down with tactical gear. He is wearing a balaclava that obscures his face and limits his peripheral vision. His clothing is bulky, clearly chosen to conceal his identity and protect him from the harsh desert cold, but it also severely restricts his range of motion. Strapped to his back is a 25-liter backpack. We know from investigators that it is an Ozark Trail hiker pack. A 25-liter bag is not small. When fully packed, it throws off your center of gravity. On his hip, he is wearing a prominent gun holster, and the most crucial detail of all, he has a flashlight clamped tightly between his teeth. He is using a bite light because he needs his hands free to tamper with the camera and break the security system. The problem is, when you put these two completely mismatched physical profiles together, the narrative of a single attacker totally breaks down. Imagine the logistics of this scenario. This masked man breaks into a dark, quiet house. He has a heavy backpack pulling on his shoulders, a gun holstered on his hip, creating an awkward obstacle on his side, and a flashlight in his mouth providing only a narrow, bouncing beam of light. His hands are supposedly free, but they are wrapped in thick gloves, reducing his tactile sensation. He has to navigate unfamiliar hallways, find the master bedroom, and then somehow subdue an 84-year-old woman. But he cannot simply grab her and drag her. She is too frail. If he pulls her roughly, she falls, and a falling body makes a massive amount of noise. If he tries to carry her over his shoulder, he has to contend with his own bulky 25 lighter backpack and the weapon on his hip. How does a man, already weighed down and physically restricted, gracefully pick up a human being and carry her out the door without dropping her, bumping into walls, or knocking over furniture? What struck me here was the absolute absurdity of the contrast between the pristine, silent crime scene inside the house and the incredibly bulky, clumsy appearance of the kidnapper outside. If you have ever tried to carry a sleeping person, let alone an awake, terrified, frail elderly woman, you know it requires balance, leverage, and usually two free hands holding the person close to your chest. You cannot do that effectively with a massive hiking pack strapped to your back. If she panicked and struggled even slightly, they both would have gone crashing into a wall. When deputies arrived, the house was eerily undisturbed. No smashed lamps or overturned tables indicated a desperate struggle. The intact environment implies a surgical, controlled extraction. A guy stumbling around with a heavy pack cannot execute a silent extraction alone. He would definitely need help. Let us move past the physical limitations of our prime suspect and look directly at the layout of the crime scene itself. When you study a home invasion, the very first thing you map out is the points of entry and the sequence of events. Nancy Guthrie lived in a large, isolated desert property. The house is expansive, surrounded by rough terrain and darkness. To breach a house like this, an intruder has to neutralize the security measures first. The timeline provided by the authorities gives us a highly specific window of opportunity. At 1:47 in the morning, the front doorbell camera disconnected. It did not just lose its wireless connection or experience a random power outage. The device was physically torn away from its mounting bracket on the wall. We know this because the recovered still images show the masked figure reaching right for the lens just seconds before the feed goes completely black. At the same time, we have to look at what was happening on the exact opposite side of the property. Based on multiple law enforcement leaks and investigative reports, the front door was not the only area targeted that night. The back of the house was hit, too. The reports indicate that the rear security floodlights, the motion sensor lights designed to illuminate the backyard and deter trespassers, were completely smashed. They were not just unscrewed or turned off, they were broken. Furthermore, when the first responding deputies finally arrived at the property the following afternoon, they found the back door wide open. Not just unlocked, but wide open to the desert elements. In other words, we are looking at a simultaneous or near simultaneous breach from two completely different directions. Now, I want you to visualize the lone wolf theory in this specific context. Imagine this single, heavily burdened man. He walks up to the front porch. He rips the doorbell camera off the wall. Then, instead of immediately entering the house through the front door he just compromised, he supposedly runs all the way around the perimeter of this large desert home in the pitch black. He navigates through cactus and gravel just to get to the backyard. Once he is back there, he has to reach up or find a way to smash the security floodlights. After making all of that noise, He finally kicks the back door wide open and enters the home to find an 84-year-old woman. Does that sequence of events make any logical sense to you? It absolutely does not. Time is the absolute most critical element in any successful kidnapping operation today. Every single second you spend outside the house making extra noise is another second the victim has to wake up, realize exactly what is happening, and urgently dial 911. A solitary attacker wants to get in and get out as fast as humanly possible. They do not do laps around the house destroying every single piece of security hardware they can possibly find. That type of behavior takes way too much time and creates way too much unnecessary exposure for one person. But if you have a team, the entire dynamic changes immediately. This was a classic two-front attack. It is a highly tactical military-style maneuver that requires careful planning and flawless execution. One person, acting as the muscle or the decoy, directly approaches the front door. He is the specific guy caught on the 4 recovered frames of footage. He makes absolutely sure the main camera goes blind. His sole job is to draw attention and secure the primary exit route out of the home. Meanwhile, the second person, the hidden accomplice, moves silently through the dark backyard. This second individual completely smashes the floodlights to ensure they cannot be seen by any neighbors or distant cameras, and then forcefully breaches the back door. They divide the labor to conquer the entire security system in half the time. This highly coordinated effort explains exactly why the massive house was compromised so thoroughly and so surprisingly quickly. Do you really believe that a lone guy would run frantically from the front door to the back door in the pitch black dark to smash every single security light? Or is this clearly an organized and professional break-in? Let me know your honest thoughts down below in the comments section. Because to me, the evidence loudly screams that there was a highly coordinated team on that property. And then we arrive at what I believe is the most damning piece of physical evidence in this entire investigation. We must look straight down at the floor. Law enforcement officially confirmed a horrifying detail early on in the case. They found the victim's blood at the crime scene. Specifically, they found drops of Nancy's blood starting from deep inside her home, continuing straight down the main hallway, and leading all the way out to the front porch area where that camera was dismantled. But it is not just the simple presence of the blood that breaks this case wide open. It is the exact shape and the specific pattern of those blood drops. In the world of forensic science, bloodstain pattern analysis tells a profound story that the victim simply cannot. The core analysis of the crime scene photos and investigative leaks reveals something truly bizarre. The drops of blood found inside the house and outside on the porch fell at a perfect 90-degree angle. In forensics, these are properly called passive drops. They happen when a bleeding source is moving and the blood falls straight down under the pure force of gravity. They form nearly perfect, completely round circles on the hard surface. But here is the absolutely most crucial part of this entire forensic discovery. There were absolutely no smears to be found. There were no footprints tracking through the red drops. There were no drag marks, no scuff marks from heavy shoes, and no scratch marks on the floorboards indicating a desperate struggle. The scene was clinically clean, except for those perfect, round, 90-degree droplets falling straight down from the air to the ground. Why is this specific scientific detail so monumentally important? Let us think deeply about the strict physics of a kidnapping involving a frail, 84-year-old woman who is suddenly bleeding. If a single attacker, especially one wearing bulky tactical gear and a heavy 25-liter backpack, tries to move an incapacitated or uncooperative adult, it is an incredibly clumsy and awkward process. If one person simply grabs her by the arms or by the shoulders and pulls her forcefully down the hallway, her feet and legs will inevitably drag on the ground. If she is bleeding, that blood is going to get severely smeared and violently wiped across the floor as her clothes, her limp limbs, or the attacker's heavy boots step directly in it and drag through it. Dragging a human body creates a highly chaotic, terribly messy blood trail. It creates long elongated stains, frantic wipes, and massive thick smears. It never, ever creates a neat little line of perfect, round, 90-degree drops. Which tells us exactly how Nancy was moved that terrible night. The only logically possible way for human blood to fall straight down into perfect 90-degree circles, without a single smear or drag mark anywhere on the floor, is if the bleeding source was elevated entirely off the ground. Nancy was not dragged. She was not pulled. She was physically lifted completely up into the empty air and smoothly carried out of her beloved home. Now, try to mentally picture that lone wolf suspect on the camera trying to do this. Remember, he has a massive hiking pack strapped tightly to his back, a gun on his hip, and he desperately needs his hands to manage the heavy doors. Carrying a completely incapacitated adult, completely off the ground, smoothly enough to not leave a single scuff mark or footprint in the dripping blood, is virtually impossible for one heavily burdened man. It requires extreme balance, constant stability, and serious physical leverage. To execute a clean, elevated carry like this, you need one person holding the upper body and another person holding the legs. It essentially takes at least 2 strong people to lift and carry an adult victim that neatly through a house and out the door. At this point, I started questioning whether we were being purposefully led down the wrong path by the police from the very beginning. Why allow the public to focus so obsessively on the image of a single masked man, when the undeniable forensic evidence written right on the floor clearly proves he had a coordinated team inside? The blood simply does not lie. The perfect, undisturbed drops falling from a certain height prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that a group of attackers walked through that hallway, carrying Nancy between them into the dark. Meanwhile, as investigators were obsessively combing through the pristine crime scene inside that isolated desert home, another massive development was happening completely off the property. When you are looking at a highly coordinated crime, you cannot just look at the epicenter. You have to look at the escape routes. The perpetrators had to leave the area, and in their rush to put distance between themselves and the house, they made a critical decision. Search teams, including dedicated volunteers and trained law enforcement personnel, began expanding their search grid outward. They scoured the lonely, dusty roads leading away from the wealthy neighborhood, looking for anything that might have been tossed out of a fleeing vehicle. And sure enough, their grueling efforts paid off in a very significant way. They found a crucial piece of physical evidence that completely changes our understanding of the man caught on the doorbell camera. Exactly 2 miles away from Nancy Guthrie's front door, sitting abandoned on the side of the road, investigators discovered a pair of discarded gloves. Now, finding random gloves in the desert might not seem like a smoking gun right away. In fact, searchers actually found about 16 different pairs of gloves in the general vicinity during their massive sweep. But this specific pair immediately caught the attention of the forensic teams. Preliminary testing at a private laboratory in Florida confirmed that this pair of gloves contained biological material. They extracted a clear profile of male DNA, but when they ran this unknown male profile through the massive federal database known as the Combined DNA Index System, it came back entirely blank. There were 0 matches among the 19 million profiles of known offenders. This was a ghost. But it was a ghost who had touched those gloves, and the style of those gloves perfectly matched what was seen on the surveillance video. Let us go back and look at that chilling video footage of the suspect at the front door. The man is covered from head to toe. He is wearing a dark balaclava, a thick jacket, and, most importantly, heavy gloves on both of his hands. He is taking absolutely zero chances of leaving a single fingerprint on that doorbell or the brick wall. But he has a major problem. He needs light to see what he is doing while he dismantles the camera, and he needs both of his hands to do the actual physical work. His solution is simple but highly revealing. He holds a small flashlight securely between his teeth. This bite light is a common tool for mechanics and tactical operators, but it creates a massive forensic vulnerability. Human mouths are absolutely full of saliva, and saliva is an incredibly rich source of identifiable human DNA. Think about the exact sequence of his movements. He finishes tampering with the camera. The lens goes dark. Now, he has to leave the porch. He cannot keep that flashlight in his mouth forever. He reaches up with his heavily gloved hand to pull the wet flashlight from between his teeth. In that exact fraction of a second, a significant transfer of biological evidence occurs. Copious amounts of his own saliva, absolutely loaded with his unique DNA, are smeared directly onto the fabric or leather of his gloves. He knows this. He is clearly a highly calculated and careful individual. He understands forensic science enough to cover his face and his hands before approaching a modern security camera. Because of that, he knows those gloves are now completely compromised. They are a ticking time bomb of evidence tying him directly to the scene. He cannot risk taking those contaminated gloves back to his house or leaving them inside his car. He definitely cannot risk dropping them anywhere near the property. He keeps them until they are far enough away. Exactly 2 miles down the road, he rolls down the window and tosses them out. He thinks he is finally erasing his connection to the crime forever. But here is the ultimate logical conclusion we must draw today. If this man was so vigilant about his DNA that he threw his saliva-stained gloves out of a car 2 miles away, there is no way he is the same careless person who left mixed DNA right in the middle of the bedroom. The man on the porch was just a highly calculated decoy. He controlled his forensic footprint perfectly. The mixed DNA found inside the house belongs entirely to his hidden accomplices. Let us leave the dusty desert road where those discarded gloves were found and step back inside the crime scene. We have to look at what the investigators discovered in the very room where Nancy slept. The local sheriff sent the biological evidence collected from the interior of the house to a highly specialized facility called DNA Labs International located in Florida. This facility is renowned for solving incredibly complex cases. They have the best technology available to extract genetic profiles from the smallest microscopic samples. But the forensic scientists down in Florida hit a massive roadblock during their routine testing procedures. They publicly admitted to journalists that they were struggling to isolate a clear profile from the biological material found inside the house. Why would a top-tier laboratory suddenly struggle with a modern forensic sample collected by trained professionals? The answer to that question blows the lone wolf theory completely out of the water. The sample they recovered was not a single, clean genetic fingerprint. It was mixed DNA. To understand the extreme gravity of this situation, we absolutely need to look at the analysis provided by Cece Moore, a leading national expert in genetic genealogy. She clearly explained that a mixed sample is incredibly difficult to untangle because it contains the genetic material of multiple different individuals. If the sample was simply Nancy's blood mixed with one single attacker's sweat, the laboratory could easily separate her known profile from the unknown male. They do that kind of extraction all the time. The fact that the laboratory is struggling so much strongly suggests that the mixture contains the DNA of 2 or more completely unknown people. And this is important because we must remember the physical condition of the man caught on the doorbell camera. We just established that he was covered from head to toe. He was wearing a thick balaclava, heavy clothing, and gloves. He specifically went out of his way to ensure he did not leave his own biological material behind at the front door. We know he discarded his saliva-stained gloves 2 miles away. So, if the heavily armored guy on the porch was so incredibly careful about hiding his identity and preventing any genetic transfer, whose DNA was left all over the inside of the house. According to the forensic experts, the mixed sample found indoors is highly likely to be transferred DNA, which is often called touch DNA. This consists of microscopic skin cells, invisible drops of sweat, and natural body oils left behind when someone physically interacts with an environment. Leaving touch DNA requires exposed skin or intense physical exertion that causes sweat to drip. The heavily concealed man at the front door was simply not equipped to leave a complex mixture of touch DNA inside the bedroom. He was wrapped up tight. Which means, the only logical explanation for finding the genetic material of multiple unknown people inside that specific room is that there were other people in there. The man dismantling the security camera was merely a distraction. He was the designated decoy, stationed at the front to blind the system and secure the perimeter. While he was busy doing that, his hidden accomplices, the actual extraction team, slipped in through the back. These accomplices were the ones who directly entered the bedroom. They were the ones who physically subdued Nancy. And because lifting and carrying an 84-year-old woman is physically demanding, they sweated. They touched the door frames. They grabbed the victim. In the heat of the moment, these shadow figures left their microscopic signatures behind, blending together to create the complex mixed DNA sample that is currently sitting in the Florida laboratory. DNA simply does not lie. It is the silent, unbiased witness to the terrible chaos that unfolded that specific night. If you put yourself in the shoes of a lead investigator, is the laboratory finding the biological material of multiple unknown strangers mixed together inside the house enough for you to confidently confirm that this is a coordinated kidnapping ring? Please let me know your thoughts down in the comments below right now. We need to closely look at the undeniable facts presented here. The sheer presence of multiple foreign genetic profiles, deeply hidden inside the home, absolutely shatters the narrative of a single suspect entirely. The forensic evidence clearly proves that a dangerous team of attackers infiltrated that house while the world was staring at one man on a camera. The media has been absolutely relentless in their ongoing criticism of the local law enforcement handling this high-profile investigation. Specifically, the public outrage is directed squarely at Sheriff Chris Nanos. Newspapers and television news anchors are essentially crucifying him on a daily basis. Why? Because he has completely locked down the flow of information. According to leaked reports from inside the department, the sheriff is refusing to share crucial details with the broader investigative team. He is reportedly only working directly with 2 senior subordinate officers. He has effectively created a tiny, impenetrable bubble at the very top of the command chain. And even more shocking to the public and the press, he is allegedly keeping the Federal Bureau of Investigation completely uninformed on major developments. Sidelining federal agents in a major kidnapping case seems absolutely absurd on the surface. It looks exactly like pure ego, incompetence, or a massive institutional cover-up. That's when we have to stop looking at this through the lens of a media circus and start meticulously analyzing it like a strategic, tactical operation. Let us connect the forensic dots we have already established. The sheriff knows all about the perfect 90-degree blood drops on the floor. He knows all about the smashed floodlights at the back of the house. Most importantly, he possesses the official laboratory reports confirming the presence of mixed DNA belonging to multiple unknown individuals inside the bedroom. He knows with absolute scientific certainty that this was a highly coordinated criminal group effort, not a solitary rogue attacker. This is the part I couldn't get past. Sidelining the Federal Bureau of Investigation and shutting out veteran detectives could be a dangerous, career-ending move, or it could be a perfectly orchestrated psychological trap. If you know you are hunting a highly organized crew of criminals, your absolute greatest weapon is not just forensic science. It is pure, unadulterated paranoia. Criminal conspiracies are notoriously fragile constructs. They are built entirely on a foundation of mutual greed and mutual fear. When the external pressure mounts, that foundation always begins to crack. By locking down the case files and refusing to hold press conferences, the sheriff is starving the kidnappers of the one thing they desperately crave: information. They absolutely do not know what the police know. They do not know if they perhaps left a fingerprint, a stray strand of hair, or a microscopic drop of sweat. The silence from the authorities is deafening, and in that silence, a guilty imagination runs absolutely wild. The reason this matters is directly tied to the reward money. The official reward for information leading to a successful arrest in the Nancy Guthrie case did not just slowly increase over time. It skyrocketed to a staggering $300,000. Now, the public naturally assumes this massive pile of cash is meant to encourage a random passerby, a nosy neighbor, or a convenience store clerk to call in a helpful tip about a suspicious vehicle. But from a tactical law enforcement perspective, a reward of exactly $300,000 is a psychological bomb thrown directly into the living room of the perpetrators. Think about the intense psychological pressure building inside that criminal network right now. They successfully pulled off the kidnapping, but now the entire country is watching them. The heat is unbearable. And sitting right in the middle of their tense, highly paranoid circle is the very real promise of $300,000 in clean, life-changing cash. The sheriff and his two trusted commanders are not waiting for a random citizen to crack this complex case open for them. They are turning up the heat and actively waiting for the fragile criminal alliance to violently implode. They are betting absolutely everything on the assumption that there is always a weakest link in every single criminal chain. Someone in that group is extremely nervous. Someone feels like they are definitely not getting their fair share of the ransom money. Someone is absolutely terrified that the masked man on the doorbell camera is going to cut a deal and trade their names for full immunity. The police are waiting for that specific, terrified, greedy person to pick up a telephone, completely betray their accomplices, and greedily claim the massive financial reward before someone else in the tight-knit group beats them to it. The total silence from the sheriff is not incompetence at all. It is a calculated siege. We have traveled down a very long and incredibly dark path together throughout this entire investigation. We started by looking at a terrifying but very simple narrative that was broadcasted across every television network and printed in every major newspaper. The story of a single, highly prepared intruder who somehow breached a secure desert compound, bypassed every alarm, and vanished into the night with a frail, 84-year-old woman. But as we slowly peeled back the layers of this deeply troubling mystery, the physical reality of the crime scene shattered that initial illusion completely. We examined the severe physical limitations of both the victim and the alleged lone kidnapper. We analyzed the simultaneous two-front attack on the property's security system. We looked closely at the 90-degree passive blood drops that absolutely proved Nancy was lifted entirely off the ground by multiple people. And we confronted the undeniable scientific truth of the mixed DNA left behind in the master bedroom, while the man on the porch carefully discarded his own contaminated gloves exactly 2 miles away. What I found after putting all these pieces together is that we have all been thoroughly deceived by one single photograph. That haunting image of the masked man staring directly into the doorbell camera was never the whole truth. It was a calculated distraction. The kidnappers handed the media and the public exactly what they wanted to see: a scary, faceless villain acting as a lone wolf. They used that gripping visual to draw all the attention, all the resources, and all the public panic toward the front porch, while the real, violent extraction team operated completely unseen in the shadows of the backyard. It is a terrifying realization that a criminal network could manipulate the narrative so effectively from the very first minute. This brings us to a crucial lesson that applies not just to the Nancy Guthrie mystery, but to almost every complex investigation we examine. In the world of true crime, whatever violently grabs your attention right away is very often a deliberate decoy. The loudest, most visually striking piece of evidence is usually the one the perpetrators are totally fine with you finding. The actual, unvarnished truth almost always lies hidden in the smallest, quietest, and most easily overlooked details. The truth is found in the precise physics of how a single drop of blood falls silently onto a hardwood floor without leaving a smear. It is found in the invisible, microscopic mixing of human skin cells sitting under a microscope in a laboratory thousands of miles away in Florida. These silent witnesses do not scream for attention on the evening news, but they are the only things that can never lie and can never be fully erased by a criminal mastermind. Now that we have completely dismantled the lone wolf theory and exposed the forensic reality of a coordinated team, I want to turn this entire investigation over to you. We must have a serious discussion about the ultimate mastermind behind this tragic event. Who do you honestly think is pulling the strings of this organized kidnapping ring? Is it a sophisticated criminal syndicate or someone with deep inside knowledge of the property? Furthermore, we must evaluate the intense psychological warfare currently being waged by the local authorities. Will the sheriff's highly controversial tactic of complete silence and a massive $300,000 reward successfully break the kidnappers apart? Or is this absolute lack of public communication actually a fatal mistake, giving these hidden accomplices entirely too much precious time to cover their tracks, destroy evidence, and slip away into the desert forever? Please drop your theories and thoughts down in the comments below, because we need to dissect every single angle of this incredibly frustrating case. As we conclude this deep dive, the most heartbreaking reality still remains. Nancy Guthrie is still missing out there somewhere. The burdened man on the front porch camera might have vanished into the darkness like a ghost, leaving nothing but an empty trail behind him. But the mixed DNA samples locked inside that bedroom simply cannot evaporate into thin air. They are permanent, undeniable proof multiple people crossed that threshold. Time is absolutely running out, and the pressure on that criminal network is growing heavier with every passing hour. The final, lingering question we are left with tonight is simply this: which one of them will finally crack under the immense weight of the reward and speak first? Thank you for taking the time to watch today's complete case analysis video. Your support, comments, and shares are a great motivation for the channel's growth. Goodbye and see you again soon. When Nancy Guthrie vanished, Sheriff Chris Nanos arrived at a silent house expecting a missing person case. But, in a move that shocked the legal world, he spent exactly 41 minutes inside before flipping the entire investigation on its head. He did not call for search and rescue or kidnapping negotiators. Instead, he summoned the homicide squad. Think about that for a second. A standard kidnapping for ransom never begins with murder investigators when there is no body in sight. It just does not happen. This core contradiction suggests that Nanos saw something so chilling it rendered the kidnapping narrative impossible. How could a sheriff be so certain this was a staged murder in less than 1 hour? This entire journey is based on my deep research into investigation files, digital timestamps from forensic analysis, and official scene reports. We are looking past the headlines to find the truth. So, let us talk about that specific number because it is the exact point where the entire kidnapping story starts to fall apart. In the world of criminology, there is a golden rule that every investigator knows by heart: time is the absolute enemy of any criminal. When you are breaking into a house, every single tick of the clock is a heartbeat closer to getting caught. For a professional burglar, the goal is to be in and out in 5 minutes. If you are a kidnapper, maybe you take 10 minutes because you have to secure a person. But when we look at the digital forensic trail left behind at Nancy Guthrie's residence, we find something that defies all logic. The intruder did not hurry. They did not rush. In fact, they stayed inside that house for a total of 41 minutes. 41 minutes. Just think about that for a second. That is not the behavior of a nervous intruder looking over their shoulder. The thing is, 41 minutes is an eternity in a crime scene. It is the kind of time that suggests comfort rather than desperation. It is the duration of someone who is essentially making themselves at home. When you spend that much time inside a target location, you are telling the world that you are not afraid of being discovered. You are not afraid of the neighbors. You are not afraid of the police, and most importantly, you are not afraid of the security system. What I found in the investigative logs was a pattern of movement that felt incredibly precise. This person walked through the halls, entered specific rooms, and operated with a level of confidence that should not exist for a stranger. In a normal residential intrusion, you see signs of chaos. You see drawers ripped open and items tossed aside in a frantic search for valuables. But here, the operation was surgical. 41 minutes of calm, calculated presence, which tells us that this individual likely possessed what we call insider knowledge. They knew exactly where they were going. They knew the layout of the furniture, so they would not trip in the dark. They knew which floorboards might creak. At this point, I started questioning how someone could possibly stay that long without triggering a single alarm. Most high-end homes in that area are equipped with professional-grade security. You have motion sensors, glass break detectors, and door contacts. If a stranger spends 41 minutes wandering around, the chances of them making a mistake and tripping a sensor are almost 100%. Unless, of course, they knew exactly how to bypass the system. When you look at the footage and the timestamps, you realize the intruder was not just lucky. They were operating with an intimate familiarity that feels like a betrayal. And this is important because it shifts the entire narrative from a random crime of opportunity to a planned, deliberate execution. A random kidnapper wants to grab the victim and vanish into the night as fast as possible. They want to minimize their exposure. But this person stayed. They took their time to make sure the scene was set. They took their time to ensure that whatever they were doing was done correctly. This suggests a level of operational security that you only see when the perpetrator feels they have total control over the environment. So, you have to ask yourself, why would someone take that kind of risk? Why stay for 41 minutes when you could have been gone in 5? The only logical answer is that they had a specific list of tasks that required that much time, or they knew with absolute certainty that no one was coming to save Nancy. It is the kind of detail that made Sheriff Nanos stop and realize that the ransom demands were just noise. The real story was written in those 41 silent minutes. Which brings me to a point that I really want to hear your thoughts on. Staying inside a stranger's home for 41 minutes is a massive gamble that almost no criminal would take. The risk of discovery is simply too high. So, do you think this was just an act of extreme recklessness by an amateur who did not know any better? Or do you think they were so comfortable because they knew for a fact that the security system would stay silent and no one would disturb them? 41 minutes in a stranger's house is far too long. Do you think this was pure boldness? Or was it because he knew for sure the security system would never sound the alarm? Please leave your thoughts in the comments because I want to see how you interpret this level of confidence. At this point, the clock was no longer just a way to track the crime. It became the most damning piece of evidence in the entire house. It turned a mystery into a cold, hard realization that whoever was inside that night was not a stranger at all. They were someone who had been there before, and they knew exactly how much time they had to finish what they started. Now, let us move from the ticking clock to the kitchen counter, because what was sitting right there in plain sight is, perhaps, the most heartbreaking and damning piece of evidence in this entire investigation. I am talking about Nancy Guthrie's essential medications. You see, Nancy was not just taking daily vitamins or optional health supplements. Sheriff Nanos confirmed in his public briefings that these were life-sustaining, heavy-duty pharmaceuticals designed to manage a serious medical condition that required strict morning-to-night consistency. Without these specific pills, Nancy's body would face a rapid and life-threatening physiological collapse. These were the kind of banned substances that kept her heart stable and her systems functioning. But here is the detail that changed everything for the investigators. When they walked into that kitchen on that quiet Sunday morning, those bottles were not missing. They were sitting right there on the counter where Nancy kept them for easy access every single day. Now, why does this matter so much? In any standard kidnapping for financial gain, the victim is the only asset. They are the golden goose. If you are a professional kidnapper, your primary goal is to keep that person alive, reasonably healthy, and manageable until the ransom is paid. A dead victim cannot be exchanged for millions of dollars. A dead victim is just a murder charge waiting to happen. Experienced criminals who specialize in abduction understand that maintenance is part of the job. They take the blankets, they take the water, and most importantly, they take the life-saving medication. Those pills are effectively the insurance policy for the ransom money. If you want Savannah Guthrie to pay $6 million, you have to ensure her mother survives the journey. But what I found in the investigative files was a chilling contradiction. Despite spending a staggering 41 minutes inside the residence, the perpetrator completely ignored those bottles. Think about that for a second. 41 minutes is more than enough time to sweep the entire kitchen, to look at the labels, and to realize exactly what those pills were for. What I found was that the intruder had every opportunity to secure Nancy's survival, yet they chose not to. They walked past the counter multiple times. They operated in that very space. But the medication remained untouched, which means we have to look at the logic of the situation through a very dark lens. If you do not take the medicine that keeps your victim alive, it suggests that you never intended for them to survive the night. It tells us that the survival of Nancy Guthrie was never a requirement for the perpetrator's plan. This realization is exactly what triggered Sheriff Nanos's alarm bells. Which means the entire kidnapping narrative, the ransom demands, the talk of money, the drama, starts to look like a cheap, poorly written play. It was a staged performance designed to buy time, or to point the finger at a mysterious group of professional kidnappers that did not exist. In a real kidnapping, the pills go with the victim. In a staged murder, the pills stay on the counter because the victim is never going to need them again. This is not just a small oversight. It is a fundamental shift in the motive of the crime. The intruder spent 41 minutes making sure they had everything they needed. And what they decided they did not need was Nancy's life-sustaining treatment. At this point, the investigators stopped looking for a hideout and started looking for a crime scene. They realized that they were not dealing with people who wanted to get rich. they were dealing with someone who wanted Nancy gone. The absence of those medicine bottles in the intruder's backpack is the loudest piece of evidence in the room. It screams that the ransom note was a lie. It proves that the entire operation was built on a foundation of deception. This brings us to a very heavy question, and I want you to really think about the psychology behind this. Leaving those pills behind is effectively signing a death warrant for a woman who cannot survive without them. So, let me ask you this. Do you believe this was just a massive, amateur mistake by a kidnapper who was too distracted to notice the bottles? Or, do you think this is cold, hard proof that Nancy Guthrie had already met her end, and the perpetrator knew she would never take another pill again? Leaving that medicine behind is a death sentence. In your opinion, was this a simple oversight by the killer? Or is it proof that Nancy did not need her medicine anymore from that very moment? Please, leave your thoughts in the comments, because this is the moment where the kidnapping story dies and a homicide investigation begins. The reality is, Sheriff Nanos saw those bottles, he saw the clock, and he realized the truth in under an hour. He knew that if this were about money, those bottles would be gone. Since they were still there, he knew he was not looking for a missing person. He was looking for a murderer who had just spent 41 minutes trying to convince the world otherwise. So, after we look at the clock and the medicine on the counter, we have to talk about how this person even got through the door without the entire neighborhood waking up. Nancy Guthrie's home was not some easy target with a cheap lock. It was protected by a professional-grade Nest security system, featuring multiple high-definition cameras and motion sensors designed to blanket the property in total surveillance. But what the digital forensic report shows is a level of surgical precision that is honestly terrifying. This was not a case of a criminal smashing a camera with a rock or cutting a random wire. No, the system was neutralized from the inside out with an expert touch. What I found in the technical logs was that the cameras did not just fail all at once. If the power had gone out or the internet had crashed, every device would have blinked off at the exact same second. But that is not what happened. Instead, the cameras were disconnected selectively. At 1:47 in the morning, the primary feed went dark. Then, another followed shortly after. This was a deliberate, step-by-step process to create what investigators call perfect blind spots. These are zones where someone can move, act, and linger without a single frame of video ever capturing their face. By cutting the feeds in a specific order, the intruder created a safe corridor for those 41 minutes of action. The reason this matters so much is that it eliminates the possibility of a random intruder. Think about it. If you are a stranger off the street, you do not know where the routers are located. You do not know which camera covers the back patio versus the side entrance. You do not know the vulnerabilities of a specific Nest hardware model. But this person knew exactly which devices to kill and, more importantly, which ones to leave alone to avoid triggering an automatic system reboot or an emergency alert to the monitoring station. They bypassed the digital tripwires with the grace of someone who had studied the blueprints. At this point, we are seeing a frightening level of familiarity with the security infrastructure. This was not a lucky guess. Neutralizing a smart home system like this requires knowing the login credentials, the physical location of the hubs, or at the very least, having spent significant time inside the house observing how the sensors react to movement. It tells us that we are not looking for a common thief. We are looking for someone with what we call insider knowledge. This could be a contractor who helped install the system, a service provider who had regular access to the interior, or someone within the social circle who had watched how Nancy armed the system at night. Which tells us that the protection Nancy relied on was turned against her. The very cameras meant to keep her safe, were used by the intruder to ensure they would not be seen. They used the system's own logic to hide their movements. This is the part I could not get past. This individual did not just break in or sneak past a guard. They manipulated the entire security environment like they were the actual owner of the house. It is one thing to pick a lock, but it is something entirely different to sit at the digital controls and dim the lights of justice before you even step through the door. When Sheriff Nanos saw the manner in which the feeds were cut, he knew he was dealing with a professional or an intimate. A stranger might have worn a mask, but a stranger would have been caught on at least one sensor before they figured out how to shut it down. The intruder at the Guthrie home operated with a ghost protocol that only comes from knowing the house better than the victim did. They knew the timing of the recording cycles. They knew how to move through the house without triggering the motion lights that usually flood the driveway. At this point, I started questioning if this was the reason the intruder felt they could stay for 41 minutes. If you know the cameras are dead and the silent alarms have been suppressed, you do not have to run. You can take your time. You can move the body, you can clean the scene, and you can walk out the front door without a care in the world. The security system was not a barrier to this person, it was their accomplice. So, I want to bring this back to you, because this level of technical mastery is rare. It takes more than just a YouTube tutorial to dismantle a high-end home network without leaving a digital footprint of the intrusion itself. You have to know the specific vulnerabilities of that exact household. So, let me ask you, do you believe a random criminal could have performed this kind of surgical strike on a professional security system? Or does this prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the killer was someone Nancy had invited into her home at some point, someone who used her trust to map out her defenses? This intruder did not just bypass the security. He manipulated it as if he were the true master of the house. What does that tell you about the suspect pool? Leave a comment below, because the answer to that question is exactly where the truth is hiding. Which means, as Nanos stood in that house, he saw a perfect crime scene. And in the world of police work, a scene that is too perfect is the biggest red flag of all. It means someone worked very hard to hide the truth, and they used Nancy's own security to do it. So, let us move from the digital wires of the security system to something much more human and much more calculating, the calendar. When you look at a crime of this magnitude, you have to ask, why now? Why that specific Saturday night? Why not a week earlier or a month later? When investigators started overlaying Nancy Guthrie's disappearance with her family's schedule, they found a chilling piece of coordination that felt like a punch to the gut. The intrusion happened on the exact weekend that Nancy's daughter, Savannah Guthrie, was scheduled to travel halfway across the globe for the NBC Olympic coverage. Now, you might think, Savannah is a famous journalist, her schedule is public. But that is not entirely true. While the public knows she covers the Olympics, the granular details of her travel, the exact hour she leaves for the airport, the duration of her flight, the specific days she is unreachable while in the air, those are highly guarded internal details. This kind of itinerary is shared only within a very tight circle of network executives, production teams, and, of course, her immediate family. The reason this matters is because it suggests the perpetrator was not just watching the house, they were watching the family's pulse. They knew Nancy would be alone. They knew the primary support system, the person with the resources and the drive to mobilize a massive search, would be trapped on an international flight or busy with one of the most demanding live broadcasts on television. By striking at this precise moment, the perpetrator ensured a massive lag in response time. They created a window of vulnerability where Nancy was isolated, not just physically in her home, but strategically within her family unit. It gave the perpetrator a head start that you simply do not get by accident. What happened next in the investigation was a shift in how they viewed the suspect. This level of coordination is not the work of a random criminal who happened to walk by and see a dark house. It reinforces the theory that the intruder was either nestled deep within the family's social and professional circle or had conducted an extensive, long-term surveillance operation that went far beyond basic stalking. We are talking about someone who understood the internal logistics of the Guthrie household. They knew when the house would be quietest and when the family would be most distracted, which tells us that the 41 minutes spent inside the house were not just a gamble. They were a calculated certainty. The intruder knew they had the time because they knew exactly where everyone else was. They knew Savannah was not going to walk through that door. They knew the phone would not ring with a local call from a daughter, just checking in from down the street. This kind of intelligence is the hallmark of a targeted hit. It is the signature of someone who has mapped out not just the security cameras, but the lives of the people they are victimizing. At this point, I started questioning the sheer coldness of this planning. To wait for the exact moment a daughter leaves her mother to go represent her country on the world stage. That takes a specific kind of malice. It is a level of psychological warfare that turns a kidnapping into a betrayal. The timing was the final piece of the puzzle for Sheriff Nanos. When he realized that the abduction coincided perfectly with the Olympic departure, he knew he was not looking for a stranger. He was looking for someone who had been listening to the conversations, someone who knew the travel dates, and someone who saw Savannah's success as their perfect opportunity for a crime. The problem is, how do you even begin to narrow down a suspect list when the perpetrator knows you better than you know them? This level of coordination suggests an intimate knowledge of the family's professional obligations. It implies that the intruder was someone who moved within their world, someone who was invisible because they were so familiar. This leads me to a question that I think is central to the entire mystery. This level of timing is so precise it feels surgical. So, let me ask you, do you think a stranger could have gathered this kind of intimate family schedule just by watching from a car? Or does this prove that the perpetrator had to be someone with a direct or indirect link to the family's private planning? This reinforces the theory that the killer was within the inner circle or had been watching for a very long time. What do you think this says about the motive? Leave a comment below, because the timing of this crime is just as much a fingerprint as the DNA left behind. Sheriff Nanos saw the calendar, and he saw the empty house, and he knew the kidnapping was just a story told to hide a much darker truth. The perpetrator did not just take Nancy. They stole the one moment when her family could not reach back to save her. So, at this stage of the investigation, the evidence was screaming, but the narrative was still trying to whisper a different story. Sheriff Nanos was standing at a crossroads, looking at three distinct possibilities that could explain what happened inside that house in the Catalina foothills. These are what we call the three working theories: a kidnapping gone wrong, a completely staged kidnapping meant to hide a murder, and a case of deep insider involvement. To find the truth, the investigators had to test each one against the cold, hard facts they had already gathered. The first theory was a kidnapping gone wrong. This is the scenario where a group of criminals, perhaps amateurs, targets Nancy Guthrie for her family's wealth. They break in, they grab her, but then something happens. Maybe Nancy resists, or maybe a medical emergency occurs, and the kidnappers panic. In this version of events, the ransom notes are real, but the perpetrators are just struggling to keep the situation under control. But, as Nanos looked closer, he realized this theory had massive holes. The reason Nanos almost immediately discarded the Kidnapping gone wrong. Idea was that 41 minutes of presence. If you are an amateur and things go south, you do not stay for 41 minutes. You run. You do not spend nearly an hour meticulously disabling a high-end security system if you are just a panicked kidnapper. Panic is fast. What happened in that house was slow and deliberate. Then you have the theory of insider involvement. This suggests that someone close to Nancy, or someone with legitimate access to her life, either committed the crime or provided the keys to the kingdom. This theory explains the perfect timing with the Olympic travel and the expert knowledge of the Nest cameras. It suggests a betrayal from within the social or professional circle, while this theory felt very likely regarding the how of the crime. It still led Nanos back to the most disturbing possibility of all, the staged kidnapping. In other words, when you combine 41 minutes of absolute confidence with the fact that her life-saving medicine was left on the counter, you arrive at one singular, brutal conclusion. This was never a kidnapping. It was a murder designed to look like one to lead the police on a wild goose chase. By sending ransom notes and talking about Bitcoin, the perpetrator was trying to buy time and push the investigation toward stranger danger and away from the house. They wanted the police to be looking for a van in a different county instead of looking for a body or a motive within Nancy's own world. At this point, I started questioning, if the scene was this obvious to a veteran like Nanos, why did the perpetrators still think they could outsmart the police? I mean, think about it. If you are smart enough to bypass a professional security system and time your strike with an international flight, how could you be dumb enough to leave the medicine bottles behind? It feels like a massive clash between high-level technical planning and a total failure of basic criminal logic. Or, perhaps, the perpetrator was so arrogant, so convinced of their own superiority, that they thought the mere mention of a ransom would blind the authorities to the physical evidence right in front of them. Sheriff Nanos knew that professional kidnappers for financial gain follow a logical script. They keep the victim stable because a dead victim is a 0% return on investment. Since the intruder in Nancy's home behaved with total disregard for her survival, Nanos knew the kidnapping was a hollow shell. It was a mask worn by a killer. He realized that every minute spent treating this as a standard abduction was a minute given to the killer to hide the truth. This brings us to a critical point in the analysis of this case. When the evidence at the scene contradicts the motive presented by the criminal, the evidence is always right. The perpetrator wanted Nanos to see a kidnapping, but Nanos saw the 41 minutes. He saw the pills. He saw the surgical precision of the camera disconnects. He realized that the ransom note was not a demand for money. It was a distraction from a homicide. So, I want to put this to you. If a crime scene looks too much like a movie version of a kidnapping, with the mysterious notes and the high-dollar demands, but the physical evidence says the victim was never meant to survive, which story do you believe? Do you think the perpetrator made a mistake by leaving the medicine, or was that a deliberate act of arrogance? If the scene was so clearly contradictory, why would the killer risk staying for 41 minutes? Were they cleaning up, or were they simply enjoying the control they had over the situation? Please, share your thoughts in the comments, because understanding the why behind these contradictions is the only way we are ever going to find out what really happened to Nancy Guthrie. Nanos made his choice. He bet his reputation on the idea that the ransom was a lie. He called in the homicide detectives because he knew that in 41 minutes, the kidnapping had already ended and the cover-up had begun. So, once Sheriff Nanos realized the kidnapping was a front, the focus shifted to a very specific group of people. We call them the familiar strangers. These are the individuals who have a legitimate, legal reason to be inside your home, but who remain outside of your personal social circle. I am talking about contractors, repair crews, and service providers. In an affluent area like the Catalina foothills, these workers are a constant presence. They see the layout of the rooms, they learn where the expensive items are kept, and most crucially, they often get a front row seat to how the security system is installed and operated. The investigative team began a massive deep dive into Nancy Guthrie's recent history of home maintenance. They were looking for anyone who had been on the property in the months leading up to that Saturday night. The logic here is simple. To pull off a surgical strike on a professional security system and to operate with total confidence for 41 minutes in the dark, you need more than just a passing glance at the house. You need to have been inside it. You need to have stood in the kitchen and seen the medicine bottles. You need to have seen where the routers and the camera hubs were tucked away. What I found was a fascinating lead that came from a very observant neighbor. During the initial door-to-door interviews, this neighbor pointed out something that most people would have missed. They mentioned that Nancy's roof appeared unusually clean and well-maintained compared to the other homes in the immediate area, which had accumulated the typical desert dust and debris from recent seasonal weather. This observation suggested that there had been recent roofing work, or specialized maintenance, done on the property shortly before Nancy vanished. The reason this matters is that roofing contractors or exterior maintenance crews have a unique vantage point. They are not just on the ground, they are on top of the structure, where they can see camera placements, entry points, and even the internal rhythms of the household through the windows. If a crew was working on that roof, they had days, maybe even weeks, to conduct perfect surveillance under the guise of legitimate labor. They could map out the blind spots of the Nest cameras while pretending to hammer shingles. They could observe exactly when Nancy took her medication and when she was most likely to be alone. Analysis of the scene suggests that the intruder did not struggle to find their way around. They moved like someone who had already memorized the path. This points directly toward the insider involvement theory. When you have a contractor or a service worker who becomes disgruntled, perhaps over a financial dispute, a perceived slight, or simply out of pure criminal opportunism, they become the most dangerous type of predator. They do not have to break a window to get in. They already know which door is the weakest, or they might even have a spare key or a garage code that was never changed after the job was finished. What I found in the investigative records was that the precision of the security bypass almost demanded this kind of background. A random criminal does not know the difference between a decoy camera and a live one. But a man who spent 10 hours a day on Nancy's property for a week would know exactly which sensors were active. They would have seen the family's travel bags being packed. They might have even overheard a phone call about the upcoming NBC trip to the Olympics. It is a chilling thought that the very people you pay to improve your home could be the ones using that access to plan its destruction. At this point, the investigation began to look at the financial records of every contractor who had touched that house in the last 6 months. They were looking for debt, for criminal records, or for any sign of a life spiraling out of control. Because the staged nature of the crime required a level of intelligence that fits a professional worker, someone who understands systems, timelines, and logistics. It takes a certain kind of professional confidence to sit in a victim's house for 41 minutes, and that confidence usually comes from having a reason to be there in the first place. This leads us to a very disturbing crossroad in our analysis of the suspect pool. If the perpetrator was someone who had worked in the house, they would have possessed every single piece of information we have discussed. The camera locations, the medicine schedule, and the travel plans. So, let me ask you, which scenario feels more plausible to you? Do you think we are looking at a familiar stranger, like a contractor who turned his legitimate access into a criminal roadmap? Or do you believe it was someone even closer, a friend or acquaintance who used their relationship to provide that insider knowledge to a third party? If the killer was someone who had worked in the house, he would have had all the information we just discussed. In your opinion, is the theory of a familiar stranger more credible? Or do you think a close acquaintance was the one who provided the insider knowledge? Let me know in the comments, because the clean roof might be the most important clue in this entire mystery. Sheriff Nanos did not just look at the blood or the ransom note. He looked at the cleanliness of the house and the perfection of the digital blackout. He knew that the person who did this had practiced. They had walked those floors before. And, as he looked at the roof and the kitchen, he knew the answer was not in a database of known kidnappers. It was likely in Nancy's own address book or her stack of recent home repair invoices. So, as we reach the end of this deep dive into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, we are left standing in the shadow of that 41-minute window. It is a case that fundamentally challenges how we perceive security, trust, and the very nature of truth in a digital age. When you look back at everything we have uncovered, the legacy of this investigation is not found in the loud, dramatic headlines about $6 million ransoms or Bitcoin wallets. Instead, the truth is buried in the quiet, clinical details that the perpetrator thought no one would notice. The biggest lesson this case teaches us is that the smallest details, something as simple as a forgotten pill bottle on a kitchen counter or a specific timestamp on a server, have the power to shatter even the most sophisticated lies. The perpetrator spent an incredible amount of effort to craft a perfect scene. They disabled the cameras with surgical precision. They timed their strike with a global event like the Olympics, and they stayed for 41 minutes to ensure everything looked exactly as they intended. But, ironically, it was that very perfection that gave them away. In the world of criminal investigation, a scene that is too clean, too coordinated, and too logical often points toward a massive deception. We learn that we should never simply believe the surface of a perfect crime scene. Perfection is not a natural state of human chaos. It is a sign of a staged performance. What struck me here was how fast the truth actually came out. Think about the pressure Sheriff Nanos was under. He had the national media breathing down his neck, and a famous family desperate for answers. A lesser investigator might have played it safe, followed the kidnapping protocol for weeks, and hoped for a breakthrough. But Nanos did not need a body to understand the gravity of the situation. He just needed to read the silence of that house. He listened to what the missing medicine bottles were saying. He listened to what the 41 minutes of calm movement was telling him. In less than 1 hour, he realized that the house was not a crime scene of a kidnapping, it was a monument to a murder. This brings me back to the core of our investigation. I have laid out all the pieces of this 41-minute puzzle for you. We have looked at the security bypass, the medical death sentence, the Olympic timing, and the familiar strangers who may have held the keys to the kingdom. So, now it is your turn to weigh in. I have presented the full picture of 41 minutes. Who do you think possessed enough insider knowledge to pull this off without leaving a single trace of panic? Was it a contractor who mapped the house from the roof? Was it a disgruntled service provider who knew the codes? Or was it someone even closer, someone who knew exactly how much Savannah Guthrie's absence would hurt? Please, share your own theories in the comments. I want to know which detail was the smoking gun for you. Because the reality is, Nancy Guthrie has still not been found. As of today, she remains a missing person in the eyes of the law, but a homicide victim in the eyes of the evidence. The intruder who spent 41 minutes walking through her life is still a ghost, a silhouette in a mask that the cameras failed to capture. We are left wondering if the truth lies with the parasitic extortionists like Derek Colella, who tried to profit from the pain, or if it lies with someone much more dangerous, someone who once stepped through that front door with a legitimate reason and a key in their hand. In other words, the clock stopped for Nancy Guthrie at 1:47 in the morning, but for us, the search for justice continues. The 41-minute legacy is a haunting reminder that our homes are only as secure as the people we let into them. Whether this ghost is eventually caught or remains a shadow in the desert, we will always remember that it only took 41 minutes to destroy a life, but it has taken a lifetime of questions to try and find the pieces. The question is no longer just, where is Nancy? But, who was the master of the house that night? The truth is out there, hidden somewhere in the silence of those 41 minutes. Thank you for following this journey of deciphering those 41 fateful minutes. Please share your hypothesis in the comments.